the air feels good.
Yeah.
Boy, wow. Okay. Are we running? We're good? We're going? Yeah, and we're found out we're embedded and everything, so we're good? Okay, all right. Welcome. Welcome everyone to Utopia 813. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and I have the privilege to welcome Amna Akbar, Derecka Purnell, and Cornel West to this public seminar on the role of law, the role of radical and rebellious lawyering, the role of critical legal thought and critical race theory in the present and the future of progressive or radical movement politics. What is the role and function of the law in contemporary progressive politics? Do legal institutions represent crucial terrain on which significant social change can take place? If so, how? In what ways? How can progressive lawyers remain true to their moral convictions and political goals? Now, you might think I'm reading from a contemporary review or a book that was just published. But those questions, so urgent for us today, come from our dear friend Cornel West's formative 1990 article on the role of law in progressive politics. That 1990 essay, in which Professor West set forth a radical vision for lawyering, and which was so formative to so many of us young lawyers and critical theorists at the time, it's as contemporary today as it was edgy and important back then. And it still poses the key questions that we urgently need to address in these times of political crisis. Derecka Purnell and Amna Akbar have been two of the most productive practitioners, critical theorists, organizers over the last decade who have risen to the challenge. I mean it, Derecka, who have risen to the challenge and helped transform how we think about the law and lawyering in movement politics. In her brilliant book, Becoming Abolitionist, I forgot my props here. Hold on. Don't hide that.
Well, you just make them. This is the purpose.
Becoming Abolitionists, Derecka Purnell recounts how she evolved from a law student and a lawyer trained at Harvard to become a movement organizer and reshape the role of law in movement work. In her daily abolitionist practice, Derecka Purnell gives us a role model for a new way to think about legal transformation in progressive politics. Amna Akbar has been writing at the intersection of law and social movements for many years now. And along with Jocelyn Simonson and Samir Ashar has developed this idea, this novel idea of movement law. What role does the law play in our political climate? Amna Akbar and her colleagues ask, echoing, right, the questions that were posed in Cornel West's 1990 essay. And they propose that we should think about law in and with social movements, a distinctive form of legal thinking we call movement law. In our conception, movement law is not the academic study of social movements. It is a praxis that requires thinking and experimenting alongside movements. I couldn't think of better interlocutors to address these questions, these pressing questions of law and social movements at this time. It's a true honor and a privilege for me and for all of us to welcome Amna Akbar, Derecka Purnell, and Cornel West. Let me just say a few more introductory words about each of them. Professor Cornel West, of course, is one of our greatest and most inspiring critical thinkers alive today. The Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary, right next door to us. Cornel West has written over 20 books, edited over 13, including the classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and of course his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He's appeared in over 25 documentaries and films, produced 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget. It's a real honor to welcome you back to our 1313 seminars. And I'll confess that our last session together, which was in homage of and discussing the work of Malcolm X with our dear friend and brilliant colleague, Brandon Terry, was a highlight of last year's 1313 seminars. So thank you and welcome back. And you'll be the first to start and contextualize the problematic and how it arose in the 1990s. I also want to welcome back Derecka Purnell to the 1313 series, a brilliant author and organizer, again, author of Becoming Abolitionist, which you should all have read by now. If not, it's available in the back. Get up, get it, read it. One of the most important, inspiring works on abolition today. Derecka Purnell is a colleague of ours here at Columbia. She's a scholar in residence at the Initiative for a Just Society at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. She's helped previously build the Justice Project, an advancement project at the Advancement Project, as well as Dream Defenders, and organized and founded the Steering Committee for Law for Black Lives, which is a network of over 5,000 law students, lawyers, and legal workers that support social movements. She will speak next and talk about her own relationship to law and movement work. And then I also want to welcome back Amna Akbar to the 1313 series, brilliant legal scholar who's also here with us this semester at Columbia as a visiting scholar with the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. Amna Akbar is the Charles W. Ebersold and Florence Whitcomb Ebersold Professor of Constitutional Law at Ohio State University. She's the author of a number of critical texts on abolition, on progressive law, law teaching, on movement lawyering, and on rethinking how we live and teach what she calls movement law. She's the editor, along with Derek Bell, Cheryl Harris, and others, of the Race, Racism, and American Law book, and is currently writing a book titled Movements Against Racial Capitalism, the Question of Law in Emancipatory Struggle. So I feel blessed to be here in your company and grateful. And in your company, thank you all for coming out for what I think is going to be one of the most important discussions I've had in a long time about lawyering and progressive politics. All right, my dear friend Cornel West, let me cede the ground to you.
Thank you so very much. Let's give it up for our dear brother, Bernard Harcourt. Magnificent critical theorist and philosopher and lawyer. He's got a golden spirit, mind as sharp as a tack, and it's always a blessing to be on the same panel with him as we were down at the People's Forum. And for me to be able to come and learn and listen, and that's really what I'm here for, to learn and listen from the brilliance, the courage, the subtlety, the sophistication of these two philosopher thinkers, legal minds, makes a very, very big difference for me. Because I never would have thought that when I wrote this essay so quickly at the advice, it was David Carnes thought about publishing it, but it was for the Vanderbilt Law Journal. That must have been almost 30-some years ago. I was about 35 or 36 years old, because I actually wrote it before the American invasion. I didn't think that it would be, worthy of this kind of reflection. It was partly wrestling with the role of lawyers who help us out of jail and the crucial role that they played. Charles Gary, our dear Armenian brother, who was lawyer for the Black Panther Party, and William Kunstler, let's never forget him, lawyer for the Black Panther Party, and a whole host of others. And we can go on and on and on in this regard. And I didn't think that I would be able to set eyes on my dear brother Kendall, who's not just distinguished professor here, pioneer. You all know Professor Tommy. Give it up for brother Kendall here. Well, I'm telling you, we're from almost the same hometown, and he's known, of course, as one of the co-founders and intellectual pillars of the critical race theory, and so many other things too, critical race music. He's got a spirituality so deep I don't have a language for. I remember being in your office when you were at Virginia. What night was it? We were there. And James Washington was the editor of Testament of Hope, which is the only collection of Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings at the time. That was a precious memories, brother. We still here in our right mind, free black men still swinging for love and justice. You in Columbia law. I don't know how you made it all these years, but because you all might not know Kellis Parker, who was the brother of Maceo Parker, who played saxophone in James Brown's band. He was the first black professor at the law school here at Columbia, taught a course on jazz and law and a host of other things. We shall never forget it. Patricia Williams was there, Sister Kimberly Crenshaw. Those were some magnificent, magnificent years. Brother John, the same way. Just wave your hand, Brother John, right? And in the back there, Cornel West analytic class of 1985. Very, very tiring figure in his own right. Spending so much time with those circles around Michel Foucault. I know it. Always thought they had a little bit too much Foucault in them, but that's all right. It's all right. I was blessed actually to have an office right next to Deanne DeFerre, who was the Foucault's loving companion when I taught at the University of Paris and Saint Denis. You know Danielle.
Sadly, he passed away yesterday.
No. You know, died yesterday. My brother. Yeah, he was a good brother. Leotard and one Deleuze was right down the hall. Some wonderful days in Saint Denis. Wow. Then Wayne, Brother Wayne, where's Brother Wayne Proudfoot? He's somewhere here. He's been there for almost 50 years, philosopher on William James and Dewey. And where's my dear brother now? Where is he? Is he now? Is he way in the back? He's always concerned with the least of these in the back. The last shall be first, and the first is last. Franz Fanon begins. So good to see you, brother. Now, this professor now, he just finished Princeton PhD. But I'm going to get into the subject matter here. That there's a sense in which this essay was a meditation on the powerful essay of my very dear brother, Robert Cover. And I hope you all read Robert Cover's work. He died when he was 42 years old in July of 1986. And he published an essay called Violence and the Word. You all know that. It begins, legal interpretation takes place in the field of pain and death. And the turn toward interpretation, the turn toward hermeneutics, even the turn toward social theory must come to terms with structures of violence that have direct impact on precious, priceless human people, human bodies. He uses a lot of Elaine Sclary's The Body in Pain at that particular time. I'll never forget that last line of that essay. He says, between the idea and reality of common meaning falls the shadow of the violence of law itself. He studied at Jewish Theological Seminary as well as Princeton undergrad and Columbia law. He taught here for a few years before he went to Yale. He died so young, but he, one of the finest legal minds concerned about situating legal practices within the larger backdrop of larger discursive practices, absolutely, but also rooted coercion, violence, violation, and his genealogy of the role of law in anti-slavery movements. And here he was in conversation with the great Leon Higginbotham and his 2 volumes on the history of law as it relates to the vicious white supremacist legacy mediated through barbaric slavery, slightly less barbaric neo-slavery, American Jim Crow, terrorism, lynching, on into Jim Crow and Jim Crow Jr., which is where we are now. And that's very important to keep in mind because you can spend a whole lot of time in professional managerial spaces where things seem to be so delightful sometimes. Microaggressions and so forth and so on, those are real, but on the ground where the masses of black working class, the masses of working classes across the board are catching hell in ways we know not of. That was part of the concerns of Brother Robert Cover. And all I was trying to do in the essay was, and I'm going to stop because I want to hear my dear sisters. All I was trying to do in the essay was to try to reflect on my own praxis and the role of courageous, visionary, and brilliant. I don't want to get no courageous, visionary, that I can't argue now. You got to get your arguments together because life and death is at stake, not just mine, but most importantly, the suffering and social misery that I'm trying to keep a focus on and a spotlight on. Ghettos, barrios, reservations, but not just here, victims of drones, victims of US bombs, the militarism, the imperialism, and the militarized sites in our world. Be it these days the police. Look at what's going on with Tyree and all the focus on the gangster-fied police and not a mumbling word about the police chief who created the 3 units. It's not just one, but it's 3. She did the same thing in Durham. She did the same thing in Atlanta, and she went to Memphis and did the same thing. That was condoned. It was permissible. The gangster activities have different levels. And you can't lose sight of the structural and institutional background conditions that allow for that, and not a mumbling word from the Attorney General. Not a mumbling word from the powers that be that know these units are at work in New York, Chicago, Detroit, Miami, across the American empire. But the focus is on these 3 black gangster police. I didn't know that black people could beat up other black people. Oh my God, my identity politics is problematized. Please get off the crack pipe. Black folk been human beings just as long as anybody else. They choose greed, choose hatred, choose envy, choose resentment, choose cruelty like anybody else. And you think that would be obvious. But if you live in the silos of certain discourses, that becomes an issue. Structures drop out, institutions invisible. And then the connection to social movements. And we were just emerging out of the age of Reagan. I'll never forget Robert LeCochman's wonderful book, Greed is Not Enough. He used to teach right across the street. You remember Brother Kendall in the economics department. Those days, a few economists had a real sense of history. Robert Hellbroners and others. We got Rick Wolf, that's wonderful. But he thought this could be worse. No. Now we've got neo-fascism being mainlined, streamlined, accessed in the electoral political system as a way of legitimating certain kinds of discourses of greed and hatred and contempt. Very different moment. I was at an AD in 1989 and 90 when I wrote this. You can imagine the blues that I have right now. Without Jesus and cognac, I probably would have snapped a long time ago. No, I'm just kidding, just kidding. I got deep love like my mom and dad, and I got friends and comrades. But the point is, and I'm going to stop on this, it had everything to do with what Max Weber called Beruf vocation. What is one's calling? What is one here to do? Not one's profession initially, but vocation. Not one's career initially, but one's calling. And how is that rooted within social motion, social momentum, and social movement? On a field of pain and death, and the role of law, which is always in some ways flexible, but has its own structural constraints. And the history of American law, for the most part, has been a facilitator of white supremacist practices. The Warren Court is an exception. In the present court, we have lower expectations. That doesn't mean that one should trash progressive lawyers attempting to engage in creating spaces and preserve the social memory of the traces of the concessions that have been made by the powers that be in the social movements that present power and pressure against them. And so there's a narrative role, there's a role of memory that lawyers can play that go far beyond procedure. And the memory actually is embedded as much in their praxis as it is their writings. Because people on the ground never forget the lawyers who ensured that they didn't have to go to jail 7 years and 9 years and 15 years. I was just with Angela just 2 weeks ago. She was talking about the fact that she took her own case as a lawyer, but she was advised by Margaret Burnham. You all know the great Margaret Burnham. And Patina Abdiker, who was the daughter of Herbert Abdiker, the communist and literary executive of W.B. Du Bois. He had a circle of people. And that's why comrades make a difference, even when they read a lot of Foucault. Comrades mean a difference. Struggle over Nietzsche. Comrades mean a difference. Why? Because the proof is in the pudding. It's in his praxis, it's in the fruits, it's in the deeds, it's in the connections. And he's not an ally, he is in solidarity. That's like saying Bill Evans was an ally in Miles Davis's quartet. He's in the band. He's not a white ally in the band, he's in the band. Like Jerry, the drummer for Sly and the Family Stone, right? Was he black? No. He wasn't an ally in Sly and the Family Stone. He's in the goddamn band. But no, it's in the band. Which means you come together, wrestle, struggle, but it's human beings who choose honesty, decency, and courage as they struggle with something bigger than them. And once you lose that, then we become even weaker than we already are, given the neo-fascism that's escalating and the Mentos neoliberalism that's posing as the only alternative, given the hiding of the militarism that it does. A hiding of the grotesque wealth inequality that it does, and a whole host of ecological catastrophes. We can go on and on and on. But thank you all so much. We're going to pass it right on to.
Sorry, Derecka, you're next. But I know you are more than up to the task.
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing?
Well, hello.
Wow, I am so tired for two reasons. One, I stayed up way too late trying to watch LeBron James surpass Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's record. Whoa, I wasn't clapping for LeBron. Let's be clear about why I was staying up late. I just had to witness it, so I'll be able to share that memory later. And then two, I just got off a plane. And so I'm very excited for my panelists, for Bernard, for Fonda, for everyone who accommodated me in my arrival. I'm so grateful to be here, especially on the panel with people who I consider comrades, who I've literally have been in political struggle with. The last time I was in conversation with Dr. West, it was in the middle of a student occupation that I was a part of at Harvard Law School. And it was such a trying time for several reasons. One, Nicki Minaj and Remy Ma were beefing. And I had the luxury of explaining that beef to Dr. West because we didn't know what was gonna happen. Like we didn't know. And so all the students were talking about it and we were like, well, Dr. West, Remy dropped this song. It's like a play on, it was a whole moment. And so I carried that moment very dear to me. And you picked up my kid who was, I think, 3 at the time and sat him on your lap and he wanted to be the center of attention. He will be 9. He will be 9. He big Aquarian energy. He will be 9 on the 18th. So this is quite lovely. So for the last 3 days, I've been at Northeastern School of Law in Boston, and actually Margaret Burnell was at the event I did today. Yeah, I couldn't even make eye contact. I was so in awe of her being there. And I had the privilege of being a Dana Fellow, which is someone who's doing work in the public interest. You come on campus and you are in meetings, you talk to students, you give lectures and classes. And literally for the last 3 days, I encountered the same sets of questions. A student would raise their hand and say, can I be a lawyer and an abolitionist? Can I do, raise your hand if you had that question yourself. All right, 6 of you, 7, 10. Okay, yes. Can I do these things? And I asked, what's leading you to asking these sorts of questions? Because in their head and what they've experienced in class is like highly professionalized education that's training them to be committed to defending the Constitution in order to protect their clients, to protect different facets of our society, to protect the country, to protect borders. And they're just like, I feel completely disempowered in class when I try to disagree with a professor, or if I don't share the same analysis. And I have been politicized around abolition in 2020, but now I have to go make summers. I have to figure out this law review stuff, this on-campus interview stuff. I have to decide, how am I going to feed my family once I graduate, where I'm going to live, if I'm going to take the bar, and how does that mesh with abolition, which seems like it's committed a political project to destroy the very same things I'm being trained to protect. And I didn't have a good answer for them. They didn't like my answer. Well, that's not true. The first couple of students didn't like my answer. And it goes back to this article, and it goes back to the student occupation. And I remember when I went to law school, I was very excited about becoming a lawyer. And I entered law school on the heels of the Ferguson uprising. And I had been taught my whole life that lawyers go and fix problems, unless you're a parasite on society. This is what you go do. You go fix problems. That's not my quote. That's Charles Hamilton Houston. So that's sort of what you go do. But then I met movement lawyers and scholars like Amna, who are thinking more critically about the role of law. Oh yeah, Mina, where's Mina? Mina, yes, I met people who were not completely committed to figuring out how to preserve the law as a powerful tool towards society, but to use it to the best of our ability to bring immediate relief to the people we were representing and broader to the people who we were in struggle with. So they weren't people who were, spectators, they were in the band, as I love that analogy so much. In that student occupation at Belinda Hall, lots of students face these same questions. And abolition wasn't the primary, political thing that we were wrestling with. And I was very excited that students are wrestling with that now. But it was, can we be lawyers at all and have progressive ideas? Can we be lawyers and socialists? Can we be lawyers and revolutionaries? And part of those questions required many of us to develop deep internationalist politics and understand how people were building relationships using law, but using a variety of ways of challenging structural inequality in our society. So as we move throughout law school, as I moved throughout law school, I found that my heroes were less like people who were committed to being lawyers, but people who were more like Paul Robeson and Lynn Holt, right? When I think of someone like Lynn Holt, he went down to Mississippi during Freedom Summer. Not only he was a lawyer, he sometimes found himself as a defendant, getting arrested, as many of my lawyer comrades did, and our law students did in Ferguson uprising and subsequent uprisings. He also detailed all of the networks that SNCC and CORE had to rely on in order to make sure they were safe from bombings and white supremacy. SNCC was, not SNCC, but Lynn Holt was one of the people who was committed to documenting that what SNCC was trying to do during Freedom Summer wasn't reducible to just voter education and voter registration. They were also trying to cultivate a robust political education program to build a movement of people in the South to learn, study, and struggle together, to borrow from Robin D.G. Kelly, to then push back on the white supremacist forces. And I know all that gets swept up in your ancestors fought, to vote, but no, there was much more than that. And I look at writers and lawyers and artists and organizers and people like Lynn Holt and Paul Robeson, who figured out what are all the different ways that we can resist white supremacy and what is my place in it, right? And so with Paul Robeson, with Lynn Holt, it was more than just being professionalized to be a lawyer, which again, if you're in law school, you're probably gonna go practice law, or at least at some point had interest in it. But what I found in those lawyers, what I found in lots of other lawyers and law students in the US and beyond, is that the people who are most deeply attracted to were people who had political homes. That was the most important part, people who had political homes. And so that was my initial response to those students at Northeastern. It was like, can I be a lawyer and an abolitionist? And I was like, well, do you have a political home? Do you have other people who you are in struggle with and asking these questions? And y'all are figuring out, well, what are the possibilities? of that particular route? What does it mean to be an abolitionist? Is it in my bio on Twitter, or am I reading and debating people, right? Am I more interested in having the identity, or am I trying to grapple with the politics? And is abolition a sufficient politic to understand the rest of the world? What are my analyses around capitalism and feminism and disability justice, right? And so what's beautiful about political homes, the best ones at least, or at least maybe mine, but I'm sure other ones too, is that they put us in conversations with people who can help hold us accountable and think about, well, what kind of person can I become to contribute to this broader fight? And that's going to be different than your career, right? Because usually your job is going to have a different mission statement than something that's revolutionary, right? Like you're going to be representing clients, you're going to be representing people, you're going to be representing firms, and you're going to figure out how to use your skills and your training to the best of your ability to do that. But inside of a political home, you understand that it is life and death. And you're going to be debating your relationship to eliminating the premature death that we experience in our world, or eliminating the prisons or the borders or the type of police that we have, right? Those get worked out, not in your career, not in your public defender office, not in all these other places, but with a group of people from different backgrounds who you're asking these questions to. And so when Dr. West in this piece, when he says, one major challenge for progressive politics is to find a way of channeling the poorest talent and energy into forms of social motion that can have impact on the ruling powers. So I took it as mass mobilization and deep organizing, figuring out how to channel these moments of disruption. I know the New York Times said we've had the largest social movement ever because 26 million people went into the streets in 2020. But that's a moment of social chaos, right? A social movement means that we have the mechanisms to absorb the masses of people into political homes so then that we can shift power in this country. And you're not going to learn that at Columbia. I didn't learn that at Harvard. I'm sure you didn't learn that where you went. I'm sure me and you didn't learn that. Where'd you go? University of Seattle? Washington, yes. So yeah, we like, that's not what we're trained to do. Like, that's literally not what we're trained to do. And so I feel very fortunate to have found political homes through Law for Black Lives and organizing and learning alongside people like Mina and Amna, and then going to other countries and hearing how students, what kinds of lenses they were using in their political struggles, right? And so in law school, when I went to South Africa, it was at the height of the Fees Must Fall movement. And here were students who were in the middle of an actual occupation of Wits, right, in Johannesburg. And the students, they couldn't go home for two reasons. One, they were politically committed to figuring out, how can we stop the increase in tuition, and how can we eliminate education, which had been not education, but eliminate tuition because it had been a barrier for access, okay? And then the other reason they couldn't go home is because they couldn't afford to go home. They literally had to sleep on campus. And while they were sleeping on campus, they were engaged in a political education program. They were studying and asking deeper questions. Well, why isn't it that we're just trying to get a few more students into the university? Why is it that we're committed to figuring out, how to make education free and accessible for everyone? What's at stake when we take that approach and ask those kinds of questions? Which is different than how can I be a better lawyer or a better student, right? It's what's my relationship to this broader society? And one of the student organizers, I think I write about this in the book, he looks at the room, which is probably half the people in this room. And he says, comrades, we're not trying to go from Soweto, which was at that time, which is still a major township that's next to Johannesburg. We're not trying to go from Soweto to Sandton. We're not trying to go from the hoods to the suburbs. We're not trying to go from this part of town and have economic mobility as like a goal for our struggle and pipeline poor Black people into nicer condos, right? We're trying to get the land back. We're trying to get the land back. And so I was like, wow, those are your student demands? Because our student demands are not hitting that hard. Like, we were like, can we please get a critical race theory program? theory is important. And part of the reason why schools don't want people to have critical race theory programs, because then they'll start asking for the land, right? Right? And so what I love about what Dr. West is inviting us to do through this essay is to be in deep struggle. And I think that for lawyers, it's not going to be enough to figure out how simply just to show up and say, you know, I'm going to be even this arm of this movement. Yeah, be trained, get skills, get the legal education that you need, but we also have to be in the band. We have to be in the fight. We have to play. And that means that sometimes not always being a lawyer, right? Not always being a lawyer. That's why I love the dynamism and athleticism of movement lawyers, because sometimes they're lawyers, sometimes they're writers, sometimes they're artists, sometimes they can get people out of jail. They're like Serena Williams. Don't you want to be Serena Williams? I want to be Serena Williams, right? I want to have that level of athleticism. That's why I have 17 jobs, but not, you were running out of stuff to say. When you're like, yeah, she's there, she here. But yeah, because I have a political home that requires me sometimes to use my legal skills for this broader political vision that we have, right? And then other times they need me to think about an organizing strategy, or sometimes they need me to write. Like I envy writers who just write stuff and put it in the world. I'm like, no, I send this to people because I know that if I'm putting something into the world, it's going to have political consequences for the fight that I have, right? For the people who I organize and lawyer and live with and love. And so I think that the more of us who are committed to forming, to being a part of political homes, and for lawyers to see themselves as a part of that, and not just some people who are showing up and being completely deferential to people who they're in community with, and also not showing up and just telling people what to do, I think the better chance we have at fighting fascism. I think the better chance we'll have at rejecting how our institutions train us to be so siloed in the work that we do. So I'm so excited to hear Amna, because Amna is one of the people who helped make me possible. And so I'm going to pass the mic to you.
So just a quick note before I'm not speaking about the relationship between law and progressive politics. The fire marshals are going to shut us down because we're too many in this room. So I've been thinking here as the only litigator on the panel, I suppose, how I was going to enjoin them from doing that. But rather, I thought, you know, offering a friendly, making a friendly offer. So anyone, you don't have to be a law student, anyone who's standing and would like to sit down and watch the overflow in 102, you don't have to be a law student or a student or at all or anything, but if you just want to sit down, Fonda will walk over there with you and give you a seat. And then when you come back, you can tell me you were in the overflow and you'll get an extra glass of wine. Okay? All right?
I'll go.
All right. All right. You're going to get an extra glass of wine anyway. All right. Okay. So if anyone is willing to do that, just come back afterwards and there'll be a reward for you. But okay. And just a few people can head over there and the rest of us can stay here. Okay. Amna Akbar.
Can I just see a quick show of hands? Like, how many people in this room are law students or lawyers? And how many people are members of organizations, some form of political organization of any sort? Okay, cool. I mean, one of the questions that this panel raises, of course, and Dr. West's essay raises, is this question of how do we move differently in the world? There's definitely part of me, especially feeling so fired up after Derecka and Dr. West's comments, you know, that makes me think, like, rather than dispersing or having wine or whatever we're going to do after this panel, you know, it'd be so cool if we could all just kind of like talk to each other about what we're doing, the kind of work that we're involved with, and how we might move in different ways.
We can do that, Amna. And we're actually going to have food come here, and
Okay,
we're not
cool.
going anywhere. We're all going to
All right.
sit and talk and meet each other
All right.
and
Amazing.
share.
Okay. So I think what I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the broad questions that I'm thinking about before, partly after hearing Dr. West and Derecka speak, and partly just to situate my comments before then I kind of turn to thinking with the essay. So here are the couple of things that I'm kind of thinking a lot about these days. One is the question of the very nature of law and why we think so much about it and how to change it. And whether when we think about the law, we're actually thinking about the right sorts of things. And here's what I mean by that. I think in some sense, the desire or the kind of fixation on law is a desire to try to understand what are the rules by which we live? What are the rules that structure how people die and when people die? What are the terms of life and death? And law is part of that picture, but it's only a partial part of that picture. And so one of the kind of many kind of, things I'm struggling with is how do we understand law in relation to other social forces, whether it's capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, whether it's the power of the boss or the power of the jail or the power of the police. The second reason I'm thinking a lot about this is because I think today's movements, and in particular, land-based movements and prison abolitionist organizing have been complicating and challenging the picture of how we tend to think about law as lawyers and in law schools. So we tend to think about courts and litigation, for example. But of course, the many protests of the last decade, as well as all the campaigns against police and prisons all over the country have pointed our attention to the fact that the law is not simply what happens in courts. The law is the police officer, the law is the prison, the law is the sheriff. And of course, for those of us who are committed to struggle and that understand power lives everywhere, it's not simply the top-down picture of the force of the police or the force of the sheriff or the jail or the prison, but it's also how people inhabit and resist these institutions. And it's in that kind of dynamic relationship between, for example, the police and the people they police, that policing takes shape, right? And that's an overly simple picture. There's a lot more going on than that. And then the second thing worth mentioning is, again, for lawyers and legal institutions or lawyers and law schools more broadly, there's a kind of crisis in our theory of social change, right? Because the implicit theory of social change for lawyers and law schools is that, kind of riffing off Derecka's point of lawyers as fixers of social problems, is that when, we have a basically decent set of laws, people have problems, and when they do, we come in to fix them and we go to the courts and plead with the courts. Maybe sometimes we're also lobbyists and go to the legislature, but that, that's how things change and that's how things change for the better. But of course, because of the way that the Supreme Court in particular, but the federal courts more broadly have become dominated by right-wing judges, now there's a kind of crisis that I think more people, not just people on the left, but more people across the liberal to left spectrum are kind of thinking about, what do we do with legal practice now? What does it mean to be a lawyer if the federal courts, which are kind of the traditional terrain of social change work for lawyers, where does that mean that we turn? So those are some of the big questions I'm thinking about. So it's an extraordinary privilege and honor to be here. I have to share with you, just because I feel so happy about that. So this event happened because I asked Bernard if we could do it, and I didn't think we were going to be able to. And then Dr. West and Derecka both said yes. This essay, it came out in 1990. I graduated from law school in 2004. I'm sure I read it sometime in the first decade after I graduated law school, but it's really in the last decade, as left politics has come back to life in the United States in new and resurgent ways, that I've returned to this essay again and again and again in teaching and writing and thinking. And I think of it kind of as a skipping record. I can't figure out what I want from it or what exactly it's giving me. But I'm trying to figure out how, but it feels something like a baton. And I hope today, like one of the things we can all do together is think about how we can all carry it forward and in many different directions. And so what I thought might be useful, rather than trying to make some grand point or something like that, would be to be digressive and discursive with the essay itself, to think with Dr. West all these decades later, and with Derecka and Bernard, in a very different moment, right? Because in 1990, as Dr. West was saying, it was the era of Reagan, the rise of neoliberalism, and now we're in in the wake of the destruction of the new left and the Black Power movement, and now we're in a very different moment, arguably a moment of movement ascendancy. And in some sense, the deep question the essay is asking that we're all struggling with is, how do we create breaks with this violent and exploitative legal order and engage with democratic and emancipatory practice, small d democratic, not about the party or the vote, but democracy that extends to all realms of life beyond the ballot box every 2 years, including, of course, at work. So I'm not sure how many of you have read the essay. It's really worth reading. It's only 9 pages, but I'm going to refer to different parts of the text and then respond to it. So at the very outset, Dr. West says what he's trying to do in this essay is to look for a space between what he calls upbeat liberalism that has excessive hopes for the law, and on the other hand, downbeat leftism with exorbitant doubts about the law. And so in reading and thinking about, coming to today, this is kind of what that made me think about. What would it mean to look at the law, not from above or below, but dead on, level, staring right at it? It would require paying much closer attention to see how it functions, who wields it and how, accountable to whom, how it is related to the economic, social, and political domains, how people experience legal process and legal institutions, how, why, and when they resist, because they always do. To look at this not simply in kind of broad brushstrokes in the way that I just said, but with particularity, care, and specificity and ongoing vigilance. What would it mean to study the law as a way to change it, as a part of a larger struggle to change the shape of state and society? For the change not simply to be internal and pronounced from on high, but to intervene in the material order of things in the way that we could all feel it. Things as they are and in the kind of balance of power, to build organizations that are autonomous and intensely democratic with our own organs of communication and places of meeting. We have tastes of it now, the cancellation of $10,000 to $20,000 of student debt, the closure of some jails, the blockage of the building of new jails and some closure of old jails, the 2020 protests themselves. And on the one hand, we all know none of this is enough. And on the other hand, those victories are being fought tooth and nail to defeat even these minor advances and the relief and the hope they represent, which should tell us something about the flood they are fearful we might unleash, right? So you can think about the many lawsuits that have been filed against this minor and discretionary debt cancellation. You can think about how in Los Angeles, they passed a popular referendum called Measure J that would by law allocate, I think roughly 30% of the general budget to go not to policing and jails, but to other kinds of things. And that was blocked after a law enforcement union filed a lawsuit in a court, and the judge found it unconstitutional. You can think about how Austin voted to cut 30% of its police budget, and then the Texas legislature and the governor came back to punish them and kind of discourage other localities from doing the same. And so defending these wins, building on them, requires a tremendous and constant democratic effort, because the structures of law and the state are like a chessboard, and they are playing the whole damn board all the time and with every piece. Okay, second, Dr. West also makes this, he says in the essay that this is the tripartite claim he's making. One, social misery cannot be addressed or transformed within legal structures. Two, legal work is primarily defensive and liberal in nature without significant extra parliamentary social motion bringing pressure on the status quo. And three, there's a challenge to connecting the defensive legal practice to possible social motion aimed to transform the society. Now, to have a theory of social change, you need a criticism, a sense of what's wrong, of the structures that produce the misery, a kind of descriptive account of that. You need some sort of emancipatory horizon, whether that's abolition, democracy, socialism, communism, or something else. And you need a sense of what does the practice look like of bridging the world that we're in now and the one that we're fighting for. Here, Dr. West is advancing a theory of social change that rests on the agency of poor working class people and oppressed people in their rebellion and in organization, and an understanding that the state and therefore law is beholden to long histories of race and gendered capitalism, but also to, as he puts it, the business community and corporate America. He says emancipation can't be achieved within the legal structures as they exist, conjuring the dilemma of the non-reformist reforms. but that the law and courts are a partial place of struggle, class struggle, race and gender struggle, struggles over the very terms of life and death. As for the law and legal institutions, this is because many of the state's core regulatory functions take place through the courts, entangled with policing, constantly reconstituting various markets and reinscribing what racism as the production of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, is like, whether that's through evictions, deportations, prosecutions, or family separation. All of these core state functions happen through the courts. But also because this is where people fight individually and collectively in all sorts of ways. And so the question is how to create disruptions, interruptions, displacements of power, how to create whirlwinds that build the power of those disruptions and the number of people that participate, crisscrossing so-called issues, domains of life and living. And it is within the housing, family, immigration, and criminal courts that you find so many social justice and public interest lawyers. But while we shouldn't forsake these primary modes of public interest practice, Dr. West reminds us there are essential defensive domains. We should disabuse ourselves of the idea that public interest practice is in itself radical, affirmative, or even emancipatory. It is primarily defensive. As a movement lawyer friend once said to me, you can do 500 eviction cases and you know there are 500 more on the way. But since we're living in a moment of protest, organizing, and movement, there is a possibility of a more radical public interest practice. The question, as Dr. West reminds us, is precisely how to connect the work of lawyers to the work of organized resistance, to extra-parliamentary social motion. And here I'm thinking, I thought of Francis Fox Piven and Cloward's Poor People's Movements. In the chapter that they have on the unemployed workers and the movement of unemployed people during the Depression, they talk about how the Communist Party organized at the bread lines and in the relief offices and at the gates of factories where the unemployed were protesting to create their unemployed councils as a way to organize the unemployed. It's hard to not think now that the courts could be a place like that too. Okay, the third thing. Dr. West talks about radical legal practice of critical legal theory. He talks about radical legal practices happening in two places. One, in critical legal theory, and two, in the participation of radical organizations doing extra-parliamentary work. So many struggles today are happening at the feet of, or in the face of, or through legal institutions. Eviction blockades at housing courts, like Casey Tenants is doing, or through stoop watches in Brooklyn, blockades of ICE detention facilities that serve as stopovers before deportation, participatory defense within criminal and housing courts, Stop Cop City, defund the police, bail funds and abortion funds to pool resources to evade the strictures of law. In their essay, Restating the Obvious, Craig and Ruth Wilson Gilmore say this task of movements is to, quote, go deeply into the state in all its aspects, its legitimacy, the ideological apparatuses it wields to normalize the everyday horror of mass incarceration, its budget processes, its internal contradictions, its intrastate antagonism and friction. These are the places, they say, that people are struggling to piece together lives torn apart by poverty, illness, undereducation, war, long-distance migration, flight. Here, where we fight, is where the state is. Even you can imagine that it was through struggling with the courts and asking prosecutors to call for indictments of police officers that kill Black people and people more broadly every day. That's where kind of the demand for indictments became the demand to defund, right? It was in the struggle with and against legal institutions that people were radicalized. There are various schemes about thinking about strategies and tactics. Dr. West's essay explicitly and implicitly touches on many of them. Most of them crisscross with the law. And so I wanted to just talk about that, just name a bunch of them, because I think as I was preparing, I was kind of thinking it would be really important to map these in relation to one another and to legal practice or legal skills. So there's inside and outside strategies. Yeah. There's affirmative versus defensive projects. There's liberal versus radical kinds of pursuits. There's non-reformist reform versus prefiguration or mutual aid. There's the debate between how and whether we relate to the state or we're against the state. Sometimes people talk about movement ecology, having 3 different kinds of work. One is personal transformation, one is changing dominant institutions, the third is building alternatives. And there's often a mix. So the organization Mejente distinguishes between 3 kinds of work: contesting for power within the state, defending our communities against the state, and dreaming beyond the state. And we can talk about examples later about what that might look like. But how might we map these in relation to each other and to legal practice? If you look at the right wing, you see that they're using so many of the same tools: protest, litigation, reformism, electoralism, organization, base building. It should become clear then that the tools available are actually not all that different, whether it's for right wing or people on the right wing, liberals or the left. Actually, nor are the institutions that we're contending with that distinct. It's a question of how we use the tools and the forums and to what end we use them. Okay, so to close this incredibly abstract set of comments, I wanted to bring us to Atlanta, where the struggle against Cop City and to defend the Atlanta forest seems to be at a fever pitch, with community movement builders organizing, including a year or so ago with almost 20 hours of public comment for the city council, 70% against the city's proposal to lease this land at something like $10 a year to the police foundation, and the autonomous forest defenders who continue to engage in their land-based struggle. A few weeks before the Memphis police killed 29-year-old Tyree Nichols with pepper spray, a taser, batons, and just plain physical force, in mid-January, the Atlanta police shot and killed 26-year-old Manuel Esteban Baez-Terán, a forest defender who also went by Tortuguita. There, as in the many struggles against pipelines, are great potential to scramble the law and the state and its relationship to the market by making connections between land-based struggles and the environment, against the market and the state as it is. And here is where Dr. West started: the need to connect our struggles, our strategies, our tactics, because it is only here that we can grow our movements and our resistance. And Atlanta and all around us is a thriving ecosystem of strategies and tactics from which we might learn and to which we might contribute, affirmative and defensive, inside and outside.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Amna, for those comments. I'm going to, before turning it over to Cornel West to kind of rethink the piece in light of the contemporary moment and these contributions, I just wanted to add one other small piece to this puzzle, which has to do with those lawyers who have no choice but to be in the courtroom. Because I agree entirely that we as lawyers trained should, as you say, not always be a lawyer necessarily or an organizer, Derecka. And so I agree entirely with that. But there are going to be times when we have no choice but to be in the courtroom. And then the question becomes, how do we fulfill that defensive function, right? And it's in, I think in the essay, there's enough there to guide us. And to understand that when you're in the courtroom, you are not primarily defensive, but you have this other task, which is to tie to the movement and to figure out how it works. So I think we all agree on the panel, first, on the importance of social movement work, right? And maybe the priority and privilege of social movement work. I don't think without social movement work, without popular support, any reform, any change of law will hold up. So we all agree on that. I think we also all agree that law is not superstructural, right? That was an important piece in the piece. I mean, we no longer believe that law, and actually you raised it with Pashakanis, right? And that law is constitutive. And that was part of critical race theory. And it, Kendall, I mean, that was part of the whole term, right? It's constitutive of the racial order. I think we all agree on that. And I think we also all agree that the changes to law are going to have to come both externally and internally, right? And the external is the social movement work and right. And there are going to be times when you can use the internal, and there are going to be times when when you can't use the internal because the courts are just so stacked against you, as they are right now. It's dangerous to go into federal court right now as an affirmative matter because it's not going to end well, right? However, there are these times when we as lawyers need to defend people who are accused. And I'm thinking here, of the task of the lawyers in that situation, in the courtroom. I'm thinking of all of our friends and former colleagues, Colin Henderson, who's at the Colorado Public Defender, Robin Price, who's down in Montgomery at the Federal Defenders, Ashwini Velshami, who was here a couple of years ago, who's down at Louisiana at the Capitol Appeals Project. I'm thinking of people in this room who are going to become public defenders. Chris Alter, I'm thinking of Brandon Rubin, right? Who's been a defender out in Maryland, Prince County for years, who's here now teaching at Fordham about legal praxis, right? I'm thinking about a lot of people. I'm thinking about my daughter, Isadora, who's a trial attorney at the New York Defender Services right here in Manhattan and is in 100 Center Street in the courtroom every day. Now, that is crucial to this work representing, and there are ways to turn it into something more than just defensive work, but to turn it into rebellious work. And it's tricky, right? Because you're also representing a client. There's a Hippocratic oath matter. So it's very tricky. And you always have to be extremely careful not to undermine the interests of the person that you're representing. And there can be times when you have to forego things that you would want to otherwise. But there are ways, important ways, to turn that defensive into that third function, that third work. You could call it offensive or whatever you want to call it. I don't know, what do you call it in basketball? Would you offense? Offense. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, I was going to say, okay, striker. In football, right? The striker function. Okay, and and there are examples I can think of. During Occupy, I was in Chicago. We had 11 of our doctoral students who got arrested during Occupy Chicago, and great colleague and running partner and partner in crime, Tom Durkin, extraordinary attorney down in Chicago, took those cases and we consolidated them. There were hundreds of people arrested and there was a court date and we were arguing First Amendment and we consolidated our cases. So for the 11 or 12 U Chicago students, and then the Lawyers Guild consolidated another 93 cases with us, right? And we ended up occupying the court. Okay, we had 2 days of hearings. And actually the article, I was looking for the article. The article was called in the paper in Chicago was Occupy Chicago Occupies the Court, right? And it was crazy. I mean, it was amazing because we had 100 people in the courtroom who were defendants, right? And all of their friends and families and whatnot. And we just took over that courtroom, right? And it was a beautiful moment where we were able to turn the defensive action into a real part of the Occupy movement. So that was, now that doesn't always happen. I mean, in the death penalty context, after the botched execution of Doyle Hamm, right? We had to turn the double jeopardy litigation into abolitionist work, highlighting how torturous lethal injection really is. And we were able to do that through the litigation. We were able to put in pictures of how gruesome the attempt had been. He survived 2.5 hours of lethal injection. We were able to put in those pictures into the record, into the litigation. It became a piece of the record. It became public that way, right? That's how it got into the Sun Times and all of the British tabloids. It was because it was litigation, it was public, and it was what we were litigating, right? We were litigating how horrendous this was. Now, there came a time when, we had to make some decisions about, the movement versus Dole's life, and ultimately we were able to settle the case as long as I agreed to a gag order and never talk about the case again. And we did that, but the material was there for all of the others. Right now, there have been 2 other incidents in July and September where someone went into the execution chamber at Holman Prison in Alabama and came out of it, stumbled out of it after they had tried to. And with all of that evidence, okay, there's the governor put a moratorium on lethal injection in Alabama as a result of that, but we were able to use the litigation, which we didn't have any choice but to be in court to do that third purpose, right? Which is the striker function of the lawyer. And I think it's right. That's only maybe one piece of being a movement lawyer, but it's important to focus on that because I think that's really that's really one of the heart of the questions is to how to be actually a lawyer in that function, right? And I just want to say, we are, as lawyers, we are people with a license. That's what it is. It's nothing more than that. And that license, yeah, we got a lot of debt too. We got a lot of debt. I know, boy, my daughter's got a lot of debt. Woo! Boy, we're indebted, but we got that license, right? And, that license, it says, state of Alabama or state of Massachusetts or state of New York on it. And it's one color. Doesn't matter whether you're white, black, Asian, or Latin, X. Doesn't matter whether you're woman, man, binary, queer, non-binary, queer. That bar card is the same thing for everyone. And that, I think, is what we can think of as kind of one of the functions, at least, of law in progressive politics. Okay, sorry. Thanks. But now, my dear Cornel West, you want to reflect now on kind of like the history from the contextualization through Derecka's incredible intervention and Amna's incredible intervention. How do we think about it today?
Brother, I don't know if I can do all of that, though, man. We want to hear the voices of all of these magnificent people sitting here. But I want to thank my 2 dear sisters for really getting at so much of the core of what my essay was really all about. I hope that you picked up the jazz-like qualities in terms of what they were talking about. Theoretically, you have to be flexible and fluid, anti-dogmatic, open to a variety of different ways of looking at the world through a variety of different lenses. And then in terms of praxis, same thing, jazz-like all the way down. But what's at the center of it is the blues. Blues is a narrative of catastrophe lyrically expressed. Nobody loves my mama, she might be driving too. That's the king of the blues. Catastrophe, strange fruit, catastrophe. Think, theoretically accounting for, explaining, describing, interpreting forms of catastrophe. Not catastrophe as something that occurs down the road, catastrophe that is manifest in the everyday life of the steady misery of precious fellow citizens and fellow human beings. Now, what I didn't realize when I wrote this essay, and I thought very much about the letter of the great Henry James to the less great Robert Louis Stevenson, 1901, where he says, no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. And there's no one theory that has a monopoly on truth. I'm blessed to write the foreword for critical race theory because of Brother Kendall. Kind enough to bring me in, non-legal, untrained in a law school, just out bearing witness and writing philosophy texts. But it was a question of here is a way of looking at the development of the American empire that keeps track of the subjugated, the enslaved, the Jim Crow, the lynch, the demeaned and degraded. And what does America look like through those lenses? Now, I don't believe any one thing ever has a monopoly on truth. I believe in human fallibility. I believe in human finitude. And as a revolutionary Christian, I believe that most of us are thoroughly wretched if given a chance. But we have potential. Fallenness. That's true for our feelings. That's true for our praxis. That's true for our lives. Try again, fell better. That's the blues man from Ireland, Samuel Beckett. Try again, fell better. That's just the best most of us gonna do. But that does not in any way dampen our spirit to fight. Now, I would have never thought that 34 years later, I would be witnessing so quickly the decay and the decadence of the American empire. I thought that the left had a chance. I knew that we are the 68th empire in the history of our species. You look at the time atlas of world history. And all empires come and go. And most empires go because of military overreach, corruption of elites, impotence of those fellow citizens or subjects in that empire, and the lack of intellectual, emotional, and institutional capacity to authorize a better alternative. That's why Bernie was so important. As neoliberalism began to decay, people had a choice between right-wing populism and fascism or a left-wing populism that looked like new liberalism, but it looked left-wing in a right-wing moment. And we got crushed by the neoliberals, Obama and company, phone calls and so forth you all know about. So we then end up having to come together to fight against the neo-fascist movement that's escalating all the time. And Charlottesville just the peak of an iceberg when we were there. And part of that neo-fascist backlash we have to acknowledge is not just deeply hatred of Black people, which it is, and brown people and immigrants and Jews. It used to be Catholics, now they're the boots. Those are the Ku Klux Klan, that's with mobility, American style. You got a Catholic now headed Ku Klux Klan, the major branch. Wow, America's strange place, strange place. And the neo-Nazis listening to Motown as they want to kill us. That's America at its worst. We got America at its best. But I would have never thought 34 years later that the decay would be so thick and the greed would become so much a dominant way of life. And part of the neo-fascist backlash has to do not just with the hatred of those folk, but also the history of the hatred of the professional managerial class, which is to say a hatred of us. That when they look at members of the professional managerial class, they don't care what the ideology is, they see too much arrogance, condescension, haughtiness, calling them deplorables, acting as if they're better, and the vast majority of our fellow citizens never set foot in the college. So we act as if everybody's a member of the not you all, but some folks act as if everybody's a member of the professional managerial class. That's a lie. And they have been the major winners of corporate globalization as we move into new tech and new big military and so forth. So as we think of what my dear brother Jeff Stout, and I know Brother Wayne knows Jeff Stout, I love that brother, one of the towering philosophers. He says, Brother West, we're spending our time fighting with every fiber to postpone the demise of democratic practices as the empire continues to decay. That's why the countervailing forces, figures, movements become even more important. And in some ways, it reminds us of the very end of the age of Europe, which was the 30-year war between 1914 and 1945. 1492 to 1945, that moment in which the nations between the Ural Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean would reshape the whole globe and their interest and their image. And we come to the end of that age, and what happens? The decay and the dissolution of the variety of empires, the Ottoman and a host of others, lead toward the inability to authorize a better alternative. Here comes the fascist tradition and all of its forms of hatred at its worst. Hierarchy and call for order, and there is the Pied Piper. You can see it in Brazil, you see it in India, see it in Hungary. We can go on and on and on. So in that sense, I would add that larger international global dimension that I didn't have here. I actually was thinking about it there, but I didn't put it in because it was, law journals don't want you to stretch out too much. That's been my experience, but I could be wrong. Things have changed too, though. But let me stop here and just sit and learn and listen.
So a couple of things. Maybe Derecka, you might, and Amna, you might want to jump back in at any point. How much we got? The food's coming at 9, so we got about 40 minutes. Okay, all right, okay. But the other thing is that Professor West, you started by talking about jazz and blues, and just a few days ago, Kendall Thomas offered us the most amazing political, legal, musical intervention, bringing together blues, starting with some blues, and bringing some jazz down at Joe's Pub at the Public Theater. And I know some of, Amna, you were there, others were here. And it was called Critical Race Music. And Kendall Thomas did something really extraordinary, which was through the music and speaking about it to make an intervention on these topics and to make us feel about these topics in really in a different way, opening up with this blues song that literally it was about someone sentenced to death. So it was so. Kendall, do you want to kick us off maybe with some thoughts? And here, I'll bring it.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Thank you, Dr. West. Thank you, Derecka. Thank you, Professor Akbar. So much of what you said resonates with me, but I want to start with what you said, Bernard, about litigation and the work of litigation as social movement practice, because what I heard in the examples you gave was that litigation in those examples served several different functions. One was mobilization, movement mobilization. Second was amplification, that is to say, by virtue of the evidence you were able to bring in, that got picked up by the media. And what happened in a courtroom, a space which very often imposes very strict limitations on the kinds of information that can be gathered and represented, an amplification of the movement and its goals. But third, and this is a piece that I really want to lean into, litigation becomes a practice in the courtroom, became the site for a practice of education and of literacy work, which is what's happening here, right? And I often say that the university is a conversation, but we can, I think, broaden our optic and say that the university is not a place. If the university is a conversation, the university is not a place, but a practice, which can take place outside the buildings of the university. And, you know, people like Fred Merton have written brilliantly about what it would mean to be someone who understands Black studies in the university as, he doesn't use this phrase, as abolitionist work, as liberation work, right, as struggle, right? And that is one of the things that has made it possible for me, Cornel, that and your love, not to jump off the 9th floor of the building across the street, that and my students. And so I want to ask about the literacy work that law and lawyers can do, and the way, and this goes to Amna's question, what is law, right? You know, that's a big question. But I think related to that is also in this moment, the pandemic, I think, has or should have opened up opportunities for radically reorganizing our vision, not just of what law is, but of where law is. You know, I spent most of the pandemic in my apartment in Harlem, and there was a lot of death, right? And a lot of the death, the administration of death, was not taking place just at the end of the batons of the policemen and policewomen who were beating people on the heads for demonstrating, or even in one instance in Brooklyn, trying to get home from work, you know, working while black, trying to get home from a hospital in Brooklyn and being beaten to a bloody pulp, right? So our so-called essential workers had expendable lives. And so the small point I want to make, and you gestured toward this, Amna, when you were talking about the market, on this question of where the state is and how progressive lawyers ought to think about the question of where the state, of what law is. State power in this moment, but has always been shared with, and sometimes the handmaiden of, private power, right? So Jeff Bezos is not part of the state, but the power that Jeff Bezos wielded over thousands of people who, mostly brown, certainly working class, and working poor people at the Whole Foods in Harlem and at Whole Foods all over the country. That was functionally, for me, indistinguishable from state power, right? It was the power of life and death that he held over those people who had no choice but to go to work. And so even as we're thinking about the state and this question of whether to engage the state, a question that occupied many hours of my time as a young activist lawyer in ACT UP, right? How do we engage the state, right? Do we want to even talk to Anthony Fauci? Go to the FDA, sit in on these meetings, right? I think what distinguishes 1990 from this moment, right? Because neoliberalism has consolidated itself, right? In ways that have invisibilized it, right? Market thinking, the self-understandings of individuals, not as citizens, but as consumers or entrepreneurs, as brands, right? Has so thoroughly saturated the social formation that the literacy work that we have to do is also cultural work, which is about opening up people's imaginations, right? And Stuart Hall famously said, there are things that can be said, and I would add, can get done, for example, through arts and culture, that can't be said or done in any other way. And education is cultural work. So what is your vision, particularly given that we live in a neoliberal university in which the debt fare state is consolidated, what is your vision of education and of literacy work and the role of lawyers in working inside, alongside with social movements, not just to mobilize, not just to amplify, but to educate? Because I think one of the central crises of our time is the literacy deficit. And this question of preserving democratic practice is intimately connected to literacy. Du Bois taught us that, right? So that would be the question I'd ask.
Wow, amazing. And I'm thinking maybe we add one more voice and then turn to you. Would that be good? Would that be all right? Wait, the voice is Omavi Shakur. So the room is like full of panelists. You are all panelists, but I want to maybe give the mic over to Omavi Shakur, and then we'll turn back to the panel. Omavi Shakur is a practitioner in residence here at the Initiative for a Just Society at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. He joined us from, was formerly at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Before that, he was a defender down in New Orleans and also a lawyer doing police killings in Chicago, litigating on the civil side. A wealth of experience and a courtroom lawyer and a critical thinker. So, and an artist. Omavi Shakur, do you want to stand up? Do you mind?
Well,
Is it working?
is it working? Is it working?
Yeah,
All right.
Bring it up.
So yeah, that was brilliant. Bernard, I'm gonna talk crap to you about making me go after Kendall, but what came up for me as you were speaking, Dr. West, about the 68 empires, right? And this cycle that we're in the midst of, and Professor Akbar and I talked about this yesterday, is the work being done right now necessary for us to meet the moment in the event that the US state becomes a failed state, right? And are we equipped to meet the moment if that were to happen, if that eventuality were to happen? And I would love Professor Akbar to talk about this idea of governance, right? And the work being done for us to govern ourselves on a small scale, so that if that eventuality happened, that we would be prepared to meet the moment. So that's one thing. And then what else came up for me as we were talking about litigation was sort of the question that we all get time and time again: how do we resolve the contradictions that come with being, abolitionists and also being litigators? And what I've come to is that not all of the abolitionists were in these northern cities like New York or Philadelphia. Some of the abolitionists were actually on plantations, right? They were enslaved people, and they didn't want to leave their people who were on the plantation. And so what they did, even though they found their condition odious, was to negotiate with the slaver over the conditions of their enslavement, not because they wanted to preserve their condition of enslavement or the institution of slavery, but because they want to survive to get to this abolitionist horizon that we're all still pursuing, right? The problem becomes, though, if the person negotiating with the slaver acts as if that's the end in and of itself, right? So when the slaver takes the workday from 19 hours to 15 hours, celebrating as if that's the end in and of itself. And we see a lot of impact litigation nonprofits, some of whom I might have worked for, do this, get a victory and say, mission accomplished. And it's important to celebrate small scale victories, but it's also important, going to Professor Thomas's point, to educate people that, when George Floyd's family gets $28 million, that's not the victory. That's not a victory, right? When we get whatever strategic concession that is given to us in order to fortify the position of the oppositional forces, that's not necessarily a victory. And it also might be odious if we don't message that the ultimate victory is still in the making, and it takes our agency to make that come. So I'd love to hear about governance. I'd love to hear Derecka's brilliant response to Kendall, and Bernard. I'll have a word with you after this. So.
Thank you, Professor Shakur. All right, let's go. Let's let Derecka then go next, and then Amna, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I had been thinking about this in response to Bernard, something you said about using the courtroom and litigation as a strategy to do all this different work. And Kendall, you laid it out so well, like this amplification, this mobilization is a form of literacy. And a class that I hope I can teach here in the fall is a class I'm thinking about calling the Black Radical Legal Tradition. And what I want and what I hope for in that class is to show that people do that. And it's not just lawyers. And I actually got the idea from Claudia Jones, what she said when she was being prosecuted under the Smith Act. And her testimony in court was just so, when I read it, I was just like, oh, wow, she's using this as an opportunity. So this can be in the record, so she can defend herself. She can call into question the legitimacy of the prosecution. She gives this beautiful critique of the judge of the whole. She just shows how this whole thing is theater, becomes literally political theater. And I think about her as someone who's not a lawyer. She was a journalist. She was a member of the Communist Party. She was an activist. All this work. And it's just like, I didn't learn about her through my training as a lawyer, right? But if we don't also study how people who are defendants, right? I think about someone who, Tupac Shakur's mom, representing herself and getting people while she was pregnant and calling, again, using the courtroom as political theater and literacy and pushing back. And so I think of that not just from lawyers, but from also people who tend to be historically subjugated to prosecution, to surveillance, to police detention. And those people, for lots of reasons, don't have legal background, don't desire having a legal background. But I think there's much to learn from them for people who care about freedom and justice. And I think that's an important, media, not just media literacy, but I think it's educational literacy. So I think that's the broader thing I've been thinking about when Bernard said how he used the most recent litigation he was working on. And then I think in our communities, the people, when I do political education, I don't see myself as educating other people. I find us reading and debating and struggling together and being a part of the undercommons, right? So much of our student occupation was grappling with what Fred Moda and Stefano Harney called the undercommons and said, don't expect your university to sort of do this for you. You have to engage in fugitive study to understand and to then think about how you want to relate to your university and then relate to society. And it was the basis of the undercommons that a group of us, Robin D.G. Kelly, Professor Barbara Ransby, Charlene Carruthers, who else was in that forum? We did a forum in the Boston Review around Black study, Black struggle, to debate the terms of the university and what students were saying about feeling disempowered and expecting the university to treat them as, I pay tuition here, so I deserve to not experience this in the classroom, rather than being against this for political reasons. Is then connected. So, I'm going to be in debt and I deserve this kind of education. And so I love thinking about literacy and education a lot. And I find that in political education, and I'm borrowing this language from the People's Forum, where I think you all did that event. But the People's Forum does political education classes. And what they do is specifically gear it towards people who have political homes. So please find a political home, a good one. And the reason they do that is to build conceptual alignment so people can disagree better, right? And it's just like, well, if we're pulling in people from different political homes to have debates, we're learning because we need to understand the rules that are in place in society. We need to put it in its proper context, and it needs to inform our theory of change, because then we have to go and experiment and fail better. And so I found that the kinds of lessons what I draw from through political education in conversation with the art. Is Aja here? Where's Aja? We have a revolutionary poet right here, an organizer. Like when I'm in classes with Amna and with Reverend Dr. Niall Ford, who's in the African American Studies department here, people who are trying to start a union at Amazon, and we'll read a text together. Feels very different how we are informing each other and disagreeing versus trying to read. When I was reading for Black Studies in undergrad, I was reading so I could write a paper and get a grade. I was not reading for liberation. I was trying to get through the assignment. So I think that we can figure out the broad spaces where this sort of literacy and education can that you're talking about can happen, from the courtroom to these like deep commitment political education sessions that organizations do among themselves. I know with Dream Defenders, who I organize with, all of our theory and change is informed by us reading and struggling first. Because we know that it's not good enough to be smart and to be a good person. There are a lot of earnest people who are very smart who have terrible ideas. And I mean that. So how do we develop a political analysis to make sure that all of our earnesty, all the good things we want to do in the world, all of the intelligence that we've gained from school or different aspects of our life, how do we couple that with the political analysis to then inform how we do the work and move forward? And the last thing I'll say quickly, and Sarah Haley is also here. This is like, I'm like fangirling. I love Sarah Haley. When you were in conversation with Bernard, I guess a few months ago, you were talking about genealogy. And I asked you the question about genealogy versus tradition. And if you go into, Black beauty supply stores, there's usually a picture with a lot of Black people on it. It's like Malcolm X, and Harriet Tubman, and Tupac. Y'all know those pictures? Black people know those pictures. Yes. And so I think of that as like history. Like when I was walking through LaGuardia today, it was like Kamala Harris, first Black president, first Black female vice president, Black history. And so those pictures are like Black history, right? Shirley Chisholm, Kamala Harris, Fannie Lou Hamer, they're like all women in sort of politics is Black history. But what education and political education invites us to do is understand the traditions that these people are in, right? And the genealogies that these people are in. Then you realize that, they're actually very different people with very different political commitments and very different ideas about the world. And what our education should push us to do, especially a political one, is to find the traditions and the genealogies that we belong to, because that also informs the kind of people we become, the kind of struggle we endure. And so my whole life, I was like, man, I want to be like Thurgood Marshall. When I was younger, my mom used to call me Johnny Cochran. And then you realize that Thurgood Marshall, Johnny Cochran, and Paul Robeson, they're all three Black people with law degrees, with very different kinds of people. But they will all be on a poster at a beauty supply house, y'all. It's propaganda. So I always encourage students to get an education, but to always be in struggle to get a political education, so you can also find out what kind of traditions you belong to and which genealogies you're also going to help forge.
Thank you, Derecka. And I want to second something and drop a footnote before we go to Amna, and also shout out for Sarah Haley, who might want to take the mic after Amna, who's the author of The Most Extraordinary No Mercy Here, a book detailing the atrocious practices of convict leasing plantation prisons in the 19th century in Georgia. So we'll come back to Sarah, but I did want to drop and amplify one thing, which is not the non-lawyers in the courtroom, right? The non-lawyers in the courtroom can have an extraordinary function as well. And I just want to give a shout out to this book that's coming out that y'all have to get. It's coming out, Katie Owens Murphy. It's called Ghosts Over the Boiler, Voices from Alabama's Death Row. And it's basically an archive, and you're going to love this, Delio. It's an archive of all of the material that was written by the men on Alabama's death row for this thing called Project Hope to abolish the death penalty, which has been a project going on since 1990, actually. And it's their voices and writing about the legal process, what they've been through, et cetera. And that's precisely right. I mean, there is an enormous role for the non-lawyer in the legal, precisely in the courtroom, in that setting. Vanderbilt Press, it's coming out. Amna.
Okay, so I want to talk briefly about Amavi's question about self-governance before turning back to the question of lawyering and litigation. So Amavi, you were asking about this question of self-governance. I think in some sense, the question of self-governance is a central challenge of our times, not simply because living in the United States, we're subject to such an individualistic and libertarian kind of culture and ethos that even those of us who are trying to resist it every day, we tend to be, much better, functioning through an individualist kind of lens than to like trying to figure out how to work collectively. But then on top of that, of course, a central part of the neoliberal project has been to destroy social space, whether it's the unions or any other kind of collective space where public spaces where we can gather. And so it becomes like the few places are basically the church and the family. And one of the really important points I've heard Maurice Mitchell make about one of the kind of strategic questions for the left is precisely where do people go to get an alternative kind of education? And of course, the university to some extent is the place right now. And we know all the reasons why it's compromised and not the right place. And on the other hand, the right wing certainly knows also that it has a kind of potential that a lot of us live here and try to do different kind of work here. And our students are craving for, different kinds of counter-hegemonic education.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're also very focused on it. And then the third piece of why the self-governance, I think, is a central challenge of our time is obviously because we live in the heart of the prison industrial complex and a military industrial complex such that any other kind of mode of like resolving conflict, whether it's at an interpersonal level or at the global scale, our shortcut and our habit is to turn to violence. And so we don't have a lot of practice. And so of course, those of us who are involved in movement work also know that this kind of like gesture and understanding, this turn towards abolition against the prison and the police, but without having a lot of practice of what it means to be in collectives, to have discipline in a collective struggle, to think about alternative ways to manage conflict in a way that don't destroy us and our ability to function together are, again, central questions. So I don't have an answer for you, but I just want to say that this question, it seems to me like one of the main questions that we all have to contend with. Yeah. And then on the question of lawyering and litigation, Bernard, I'm glad you pushed us on that because my guess is that, to some extent, that's a big question that everyone in the room is thinking about. And I think I think the examples that you raised are extraordinarily important. And there's so many other ways that we can think about, because when you focus in on whether it's a particular court case or an occupation of a courtroom, of course, this distinction between, even Dr. West talks about this in the essay, the distinction between what's liberal and what's radical, what's a reform versus a non-reformist reform, what's affirmative or defensive. When you look more closely at something, it often becomes much more illusory what that distinction is, right? And so, for example, a classic function, as I think you even said, of a movement lawyer is the work of the National Lawyers Guild, right, which has been around for a century now or something like that, which is to get people out of jail and prison, right, to defend them in the protest so they don't get arrested, and then to get people out of jail and prison through doing jail support work. And on the one hand, you can see that as defensive work, and on the other hand, I have started to kind of think of that as social reproduction work, that the work to get people out of jail, to defend them from being thrown in jail, et cetera, organizing bail funds, all that kind of stuff. That part of what that does is it allows people to reproduce and show up for the next protest and the next meeting. And so again, those lines can be very blurry. I wanted to mention, because Derecka mentioned Len Holt, that in Tomiko Nagin Brown's book about the Atlanta Civil Rights Movement, she has an extraordinary chapter about Len Holt and the work that he did in
I learned
Atlanta.
about him in her class, HLS. That's all right.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. One of the things she talks about the tension between Len Holt, who among other things was SNCC's lawyer, and LDF and their legal strategy. And one of the many points of tension was that one of the things that he did in Atlanta at a time when segregation was being challenged in part through these lawsuits that were targeting particular institutions like a pool or a library, through filing lawsuits centralized through LDF. What Len Holt was doing was training ordinary people to file pro se lawsuits in what he was calling omnibus desegregation lawsuits, where ordinary people were going into court. He was giving them some basic legal skills and training them to draft complaints and that sort of thing, and challenging the segregation of institutions all across a particular city or jurisdiction. And that was one of the ways in which he used his legal skills to kind of democratize access to the law and use the very tools he had to kind of gum up the system in a way that the movement thought was productive. And so again, like defensive, affirmative, it's kind of, it's a little bit blurry. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say about this, just in a, what about if you're at legal aid or legal services or in a public defender office? I think the work, or you're doing eviction defense. I think that work is extraordinarily important. And I think there are ways to do it that are more subversive and more emancipatory than the way that that work tends to happen. It's been a long time since I worked in the legal services office, so my information might be dated, and I welcome input, challenge, and conversation from anyone who has more contemporary info. But in my experience, the modes of that kind of practice and the norms, even within public interest lawyering offices, tend to be fairly conservative. So the two things I often tell my students who are thinking about this and contending with these questions is, one, it's really important to practice as deep of a solidarity as you can with your clients, to listen to them, to kind of find ways to support them. A lot of times the people that, when you're at legal aid or legal services, or you're representing people who are incarcerated, your relationship as a lawyer with your client can be extraordinarily important, because the same things that are landing a lot of, your clients basically in your office are things that are causing different forms of social isolation. Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of solidarity that you can offer that, if you just kind of treat them like another client, they won't get. And that in itself can have some kind of transformative potential, or at least it's kind of like a minimal ethical practice, it seems to me. And then the second thing is to, and this is the solidarity piece is related to this, but it's more broader, is basically to refuse the professional norms of practice. Yeah. One of the things that I found extraordinary, so I started practicing in family court in Queens, and then I started doing impact litigation, working with different bigger organizations through the clinic at NYU that I taught at. In family court in Queens, like the lawyers and the courts and the judges, like people, like lawyers, the lawyers on the other side, it was just kind of like a street fighting in the courts in a way. They would lie to my face and it would be obvious. And people would just say whatever to kind of get the results they want. Then I went into this like kind of more fancier public interest impact litigation. And the lawyers there would say, Amna, like, it's kind of crazy how hard you fight. And I was like, well, that's because I learned in family court, not in these kind of realms. But I think part of what happens is that there's these norms of practice that you should be polite to opposing counsel. Don't push too hard. If the judge said no, don't object again. You're going to be in here again and again. And the thing is, some of those things might be true, but the problem is people don't test the bounds of what's possible. And when you see people with power negotiate with each other, fight for what they want, go to court, they don't stop when the judge says no. They don't stop when the other side objects. They don't object only when they have a real basis for the objection. So why is it that in public interest and social justice practice, we feel so constrained by all of these norms that do not constrain, anyone else in these forums, essentially? And so I think refusing the bounds of professional norms and finding other ways to move, whether it's in court or with your clients, is really important. And then I guess the last part is just remember that as lawyers, we are also people. And part of what that means is like the people that we talk to and we spend time with every day are going to shape who we are, what we expect, and how we hold ourselves. And so make sure, as Derecka has been encouraging you, that to the extent that it's possible, feasible, as soon as possible, join some sort of political organization, whether it's one of lawyers like the Guild or Law for Black Lives, or it's a non-lawyer kind of movement-based organization, because you need people to hold you accountable. For me, and I'll stop here, but the thing that was a real turning point was being involved in creating Law for Black Lives, because until then, all of my radical politics felt like a kind of secret that I was like fomenting with inside myself as a young lawyer who didn't know what to go, where to go. And then all of a sudden I had a cohort of young Black and brown people who had law degrees, but found the system to, I had a critique of capitalism and racism, and we're trying to figure out, how do we use these tools? We know people need them. We know movements need them. We don't feel like we have a lot of models for how to use them. What do we do? How do we take kind of what we've learned from past generations and chapters of the struggle, and how do we show up now? And that's the question kind of we're all here to figure out together. And here, like we're kind of having a partial discussion, but this all kind of takes all of us to kind of, continue the conversation in all of our different spaces, and not only in the academy or not only in your law office, but in all sorts of contexts. Because one of the main lessons, among other things, of Dr. West's essay is precisely this kind of, how these conversations and these struggles do not live in one place, they live everywhere. And so the question is how to live in the struggle wherever you are, and how to make sure you don't forget that the struggle is not only in the room that you're in, kind of thinking a little bit about Femi Taiwo's book as well, Leap Capture, and how to break down the walls of the room and kind of make a bigger space that we can all agitate in.
Thank you so much, Amna. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is what I'd like to do, if it's all right. I'd like to pass the mic to Sarah Haley for some thoughts here. I can, and then maybe if the food and wine is here, we can then close with a few words from Cornel West. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, some of us go to PhD programs rather than law school because we don't like the Socratic method of being called on, but I'm also going to join and I'll talk to you after class, Dr. Harcourt. No, thank you. So I guess I am, as a historian, as someone who has had very, very little, legal experience, except as a paralegal straight out of college, I'm thinking about this category of defense and the category of the defender, which is a rather illustrious one in Black history, right? Robert Williams to Rosa Parks being, reclaimed in the tradition of armed defense, to the Black Panthers. And so the anxiety around defense as a limited category is strange to my sense of the Black radical tradition, right, Derecka? Like it's almost the most valorized. And yes, there is a kind of masculine genealogy around armed defense, but I think that this question of lawyers having a license, right, having this tool, and the tool is to socially reproduce lives, like the lives of those who are, indigent and Black and the targets of state violence, is a rather important and unique one, particularly if you're doing that kind of unruly, rebellious work inside the court. And so it just makes me think about also what Amavi is saying about who we think we're engaged with in the courtroom, so that the defendant is also a protester, is also a rebel, is also like a member of a community that we want to be in political struggle with. And then that is about the intimacy that one can create with a quote unquote client or a defendant. But I feel like there is this radicalism, there can be a radical character to the very category of the defender, which is why I leaned in so much in that line, Dr. West, of the exorbitant doubt, because I don't know, having been a paralegal at a public defender, tried every which way to use my critical, I was reading Patricia Williams, I was trying to use every linguistic turn to interpret Bureau of Prisons policy to say this person can be released sooner. to the prosecutor's ire. I mean, like, I've never seen rage like that in my life, to say, but the Bureau of Prisons will never release this person. And I said, of course I know that. They're never going to, but technically they could, you know, because I can read. And technically the law says it's possible, right? And so to use that kind of unruly practice, but it just seems to me that there is a tradition of which this kind of defense work is a part that could be the grounds from which to lean into a kind of exorbitant doubt about law as an apparatus of power, right? Law as a construct, law as a regime of violence, which is like my position to the law, which is why I love, even though I know you were saying in the essay you're between these people, I was like, oh, I'm on this camp, and I really like it. To lean into an exorbitant doubt around the law as part of a kind of identity of radical defense work in a Black radical tradition. But that must be accompanied by, you know, Professor Thomas, I don't know if you think about, you know, what you did at Joe's Pub as lawyering, right? But I mean, to both lean into the defender category and also to expand the capacity of what counts as work that challenges the terms of order of law seems to me to be part of the project.
All right. I think maybe it might be a good way to close the session to have some final. We're gonna, of course. That would be great. Yes. All right. Here. All right.
Hi, I'm Aja, a poet. I just wanted to take a moment to lift up my comrade Mina here, as well as the work that we've done in South Florida with Community Justice Project in response to Kendall's question. Because the one thing that we've struggled with in our work in South Florida was around literacy within our community and making poetry a practice that we saw as a part of our organizing within the lawyer and movement space. And what I've noticed that Mina and I both struggled with is articulating the necessity for poetry being in the movement space, seeing as what lawyers deal with is the weaponization of language, and how language is often becomes a thing that keeps us at distance and at bay with one another. It's really one of the literal borders of the interior world. And so creating accessibility for people to understand how lawyers can democratize our relationship to language and to use their knowledge and their abilities and their skill sets to help us really think about what are the ways that we can expand the legal system and the ideas around policy, and what are the ways that we can make our communities understand that the things that they are facing in the larger context of global social issues are all, they start at policy, they start with lawyers like fighting for the law or pushing the law or defending or creating new laws, and poets, the people who are the architects, I think, of the interior world, get us to stretch our imaginations about what's possible. And I think what's frustrating is that art education within this country has, the literacy and the lack of advocacy among the public and the lawyer and the legal system for art to be celebrated, for art to be a right, a human right within our country, that as we see the failing of this quote unquote democracy, it coincides with the failing of our art institutions and the ability for art to be a public good. And so the privatization, the corporatization of our art is really linked to what's happening, the deterioration of our imaginations and our abilities to actually advocate for the things that we want to see in our community. So I want to lift up Community Justice Project and what we've done with Poetry for the People, And that there are poets who've come before us, and there are lawyers who've come before us. I want to lift up poet Martin Espada and what he was doing to advocate as a lawyer, a tenant lawyer, for people, and using the stories and the cases that he was working on to create his poems, to be the foundation and the architecture of his poetry, so that it could help people to really think about the ways that they do the very thing that you're talking about, which is elevate the literary public, or the public's literacy or relationship to literacy. So I'll end there. But yes, if you want to start, please.
Thank you so much. Yes, interventions and questions and comments. Go ahead.
Hi. So my name is Jay, and first of all, I wanted to thank you all for coming out tonight. I know that you all have very busy schedules. But one of the things that I've been thinking of as we've been sitting in this room for a few hours is the Dr. West, you often talk about the need for a lot of the movements that we inhabit to really break out of their silo, right, and to be regenerative and hold empathy in the container. But simultaneously, we also need to recognize that we have opponents that need to be defeated. And so what I want to ask each and every one of you is, how do you engage in having a container that is both deeply empathetic, recognizes that simultaneously fighting alongside with and fighting for, so that you're not better than you. So how do you strategic institutions?
Thank you so much. All right, and I'm not cold calling on anybody, but Idil and Sony, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands. Anybody else? Sony, all right.
Okay, I don't really have a question, but I just want to talk.
Perfect.
And then I'm going to pass it to Idil. But my name is Sony. I've had the honor of being in Professor Harcourt's class, Professor Thomas's class, Law After Neoliberalism. Okay, this feels awkward to stand up, but I almost cried when you were talking, Professor Akbar, because I'm part of the Pearl Advocacy Project at Columbia, and my client last semester was a Black man who's been incarcerated for 35 years, and he's 75, and he's in Alabama, and he was up for parole. They're up for parole every 5 years, and they didn't grant him parole, obviously, because they suck. But the next time he's up for parole will be 5 years. And while we were writing his advocacy packet, and there's other people in this room I think are part of PAP, it was so difficult.
Program.
Terrific, yeah. And also it's a political program as well, because we call ourselves abolitionists, and we try to support events that are behind those values. But when we were writing his packet to send to the parole board, there were things that we put in. We sent it out to SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, who we're working with, and they were like, you can't put this, right? Because it's politics, because if you say this, it will hurt your client, right? Not help them, but it's at the same time as lawyers, I came to law school because I want to advocate for people. I want to advocate for these things that I believe in. And I think that this conflict, right, it's so real. And that's that's something I wanted to share. I don't have a question, but really relevant what you were talking about. I'm going to pass it to Idil.
Okay, I just want to thank you guys so much.
Stand up, you're a lawyer.
I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Thinking of being a lawyer, progressive lawyer, there's these internal confliction of is being a part of the system, is it this weird, ironic, legitimizing function of even doing progressive lawyering? And so this was really helpful to think about it and just give us. Sorry, I'm nervous. I'm not a good public speaker, but just thank you so much. Sony or
All right, Melody. Okay, we got. You want to say a word? You got your question, and then Brandon.
Sure. I wanted to echo, my name's Melanie. I want to echo everyone saying thank you so much for being here in community with us tonight. I think I really resonated with the concept you were all speaking of about creating a political home and finding a political home. I guess if I had a question, it would be, for students who feel alienated in these elite law institutions, in these elite spaces, finding, in these big lecture halls being called on in the Socratic method, or your Professor Harcourt passing the mic over to you. How do you how, I guess my question would be, where does one get started finding that political home?
Thank you so much, Melanie. Brandon Rubin, longtime public defender down in Maryland, now also teaching and engaged in critical praxis. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you guys all very much. Your comments are sustaining to me. I'm pretty deep in the work and you can get lost in it, I find, when you're doing it day to day. And so this is a nice opportunity to zoom out and, as Professor Akbar said, remind myself to treat my 35th client of the afternoon with as much respect as I did the first, which honestly isn't always easy due to the volume and, the trauma of the work, frankly. But my question is, so Dr. West, your paper is called The Role of a Lawyer in Progressive Politics, written some 30 years ago now. So kind of working backwards, I'm curious from the panel, how do we define progressive politics today? Because I'm a lawyer and I'm interested in being involved in it. So how do we define that so I can go back in on Friday and work towards it?
We didn't do anything on this one, y'all.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jimmy. So I'm a second year law student. So I have a question about, because all of you have talked about for progressive lawyers, being a lawyer is not enough. You need to find a political home. You need to engage in organizational works. You need to engage in all sorts of political stuff. And my question is kind of reverse. So what do you think really differentiates a lawyer progressive and a non-lawyer progressive, besides the fact that a lawyer has a licensed skill to help you navigate the system? So besides that, is there a difference? And if there is, what is that difference? Because when I read Dr. West's paper, he mentioned that lawyers actually is in a, I would say, like epistemically advantageous position to help people to reveal the injustices of law or the illegitimacy of the legal system. So that's sort of where my question started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we want to get some of this side now. What do we got? Who's up? All right.
Hello. Oh, stand up. Okay. Hi, guys. I'm Muna. I'm actually a sophomore in Columbia College. So I also want to shout out my friend Batel, who's also a sophomore in undergrad. So I guess my question for you guys is, as somebody who's, not in law school, I might go to law school, we'll see. I guess, do you have any advice for young individuals who, I guess, want to see progressive change in their communities, but, may not want to go through the law school route specifically? So what does a progressive future look like in a non-legal context? Thank you.
Excellent. I had the impression that some of our conversation was actually more about that non-legal context also than actually the legal too. But we need to address that directly. So thank you so much for raising that. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Rizwan. I'm another undergrad. I'm a junior and I'm sitting next to my partner who's a sophomore. But my question along the same lines, and also with Professor Haley's comment on as an academic, not having the experience in the legal sphere, what is the role of students, of faculty members in the academy and the university at large, which is obviously a very progressive space, as we've noted, but doesn't really have this direct take in the courtroom, for instance, right? And a university can rarely get involved in an abolition project beyond actually investing in it, and that obviously has its own implications for the university. So I was wondering as to how you'd speak about that.
More behind me. All right.
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm also not a law student. I'm an MA in the climate school, but also I'm an artist.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you. Oh my God. I'm an artist, and my question, like a lot of what's been coming up, is like the role of the artist in liberation, abolition work. So if you could reflect on that, being jazz like poetic, I would love. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for what you do. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm also not in law school. I work in advertising and I work in advertising in, I guess, the progressive space, working with unions. But a lot of agencies, you might find that you can't just work with a union client. You might also have to work with an establishment Democrat Party candidate. And my question, I guess, for like the non-legal people in here is like, how do you balance working on, you know, with a union or an organization that works on tenant rights while also having to these obligations for these other clients that you might not agree with?
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, we got one more here.
So for better or worse, I am in law school. My name is Catherine. Thank you all so much for being here, and for everyone from the audience who shared. So great to hear so many voices. I came to law school to do climate change and environmental justice work, and I'm wondering if you all could consider like how abolition movements, racial justice movements, climate justice movements, worker movements can all work together, like how we can create Derecka, what was the word you were using? I'm so nervous that I've forgotten it, but like the group of people that you go to? Political home, there we go. How we can create political homes that bring together people who are working in different spaces so we can like cross-pollinate and think about how these systems of oppression are connected to one another.
Thank you so much. I've got a question here.
Yes, hi. My name is Brittany. I guess all the non-lawyers are coming out of the woodwork.
Welcome, welcome.
I'm a physician. I'm specifically an abortion provider from the South. Sorry, I did not mean this to be self-aggrandizing, but I'm hearing a lot of disillusionment in the room. I think we feel that in medicine too, coming against these horrific institutions that oppress us and our patients or clients in so many ways. And I just wanted to say that to me, your work is very real. And we really need your help. You know, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is so real. It's a daily experience. It's not a pie in the sky. It's not law as theory. It's really, it affects what I can do with my hands with my patient every day. And so thank you for continuing the hard work. I appreciate it.
And thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm with the Human Rights Clinic at the law school. I just have a question. I'm pondering a lot on this question of where we push the limits of our professional expectations, because we were literally having some conversations about this today with my students. We work with communities that are affected by extractive development projects in Honduras at the moment, primarily. And I think there's just a real challenge there of like, sometimes it really is to our clients' advantage potentially to show up in a certain way and to be a voice that's, especially in a context of massive amounts of stigmatization, to be a voice that's coming and perceived differently. There's a lot of pitfalls there of, are you replacing that other, you know, the voice of the community rather than echoing? But it is something that I think sometimes communities want or would like from us. And so I think just I wrestle with it a lot. I mean, part of what I'm thinking is maybe it's a question of we bring the communities in on that strategic decision making of when do they want us to push and when do they want us to toe the line. But I would just be curious for more thoughts, because it is my experience that while the other side, I do corporate accountability litigation, the other side often lies, they often yell. But if we do that, we have to do things 10 times more properly to be taken seriously. So as nice as it is to just say, you know, I want to act like them, there's also a challenge that I'm just automatically, I show up and I'm not taking it seriously. And if I do those things, I mean, they sue lawyers, they do all sorts of stuff to try to, you know, delegitimize practice that pushes professional boundaries. So there's the question, I guess, is just how we negotiate those two real, I think, demands of wanting to push those limits, but also, you know, really having our clients want us to show up in a specific way for them, and the struggles of the power in the courtroom.
Thank you so much, and for the work you do. And also, Professor Niall Fort, Dr. Niall Fort gave me the good idea that we should also, anyone who's doing important movement work, organizing, please tell us all, since we're all here together. And I know a lot of people are eager to work together and to find you when we have dinner tonight. Okay, yes, go ahead. And one quick thing.
There's a group called the Dream Defenders, which is abolitionists, socialists. They're all the great things with the IST at the end. They want us all to get free. So you should go to dreamdefenders.org. Right now, we have two campaigns. One is to cancel student. Who has student debt? Who likes student debt? All right, so you should go to the dreamdefenders.org, sign up, join our campaign to cancel all student debt, not 10,000, not 20,000. And the other is a Safe Streets campaign. We know gun violence is out of control. That's one organization, but if you have an organization, if you're doing work on campus or off campus, please raise your hand so when people leave, they can come to you and you can tell them what you're doing so people can join. That's all.
So I have very little to say, except thank you for this extraordinary event where I see people working from so many different disciplines collaborating. And I think the thing is to get these collaborations going. Some of what I had to say has already been said, which is law is not useless. And I say it from two domains. One is the Know Your Rights movement, which is hugely powerfully political. And I've been working on a case that has to do with live streaming the police. And that is something is spreading without advocates and without lawyers being involved, except on the ground advocates, that is people who are routinely profiled by police, have been watching videos and learning how to stand up to the police. And this case on live streaming is an extraordinary case, a guy named Dijon Sharp who was beat up by the police. Well, now it's a few years ago because cases take a while to go through, who is taking his case before the Fourth Circuit. We don't know how it will come out, but each one of these cases is inspiring a set of other people who are learning it through social media. So this is an incredibly powerful thing. And it speaks a little bit to what I've forgotten your name, but you were saying about the conjunction of poetry and law, that people who are routinely targeted by law are learning how to use law. The other locale that I know this from is I teach at Metropolitan Detention Center. I teach a creative nonfiction course. And my students know so much. I have a law degree. They know so much more law than I do. They know their cases inside out. But what I think maybe they need to be told that they should already know, but need to be told is they also know something else. They know another way of speaking about law that law needs to hear. And that has to do with turning the language of poetry into the language of law. And that's what I'm hoping we can all do from all the different disciplines I'm hearing.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I've loved like every minute of this. It's been really helpful to me. I'm a third-year law student, so I'm like currently looking for jobs, probably going to be going into house work soon. I wanted to kind of mount like a small little defense for the downbeat leftists, because I think that's where I kind of comfortably fall. And I think like a lot of the ways that we've been talking about the defense work, whether that's eviction defense or a public criminal defense, is that like so much of the value and the praxis comes from the overlap with other areas of movement lawyering. So we talked about the educational value and the value in gaining sort of attention to the issue. But I almost feel like the value of that defense, even if it's just that individual direct service defense to that client, I almost wonder if we're like overlooking that, or I'm worried that when I get into practice, that although I fully plan and intend to find that political home, to find that overlap as best I can, that I'm inevitably going to have those cases where I feel like what I've been able to accomplish is that I've worked for this discrete victory, and that I've helped this client as best I can. And maybe there are 500 more out the door, but like I did what I can. And I worry that like, and I hope that I'm like misinterpreting it, or maybe I just like want to reaffirm this, but I think that like there's also that I'm also part of the band, even if I'm just in that moment, just helping this one person, that it's that front line work, right? Like I think Bernard, you mentioned like Hippocratic Oath earlier, talking about the client. And I think like making the medical comparison is appropriate, because I don't think that like the doctors that are helping someone have to feel like they're making like in that action, like a victory against cancer itself, to know that like what they're doing for this one patient is so valuable too. And I think because I'm that downbeat leftist, I'm gonna rely on finding so much value in what I hope is like the praxis of helping these individuals, even one at a time. And so I just wanted to like reaffirm that, like, I'm not wrong, right? If I can find that value in helping like individuals, even if I don't feel at times like it's that connected to a broader movement.
Yeah.
All right, let's say two more.
Well, are we
And then
answering
we-
the question? I'm trying to keep track.
Then we're gonna do Amna, Derek. All right, two more, let's go. Go ahead, love, and then.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Hope. I'm a sophomore in Columbia College. I also work at the ACLU and my local branch of the Innocence Project in LA. And not to give you my full resume, but I also founded a mutual aid organization for disability justice and education, but that is a whole separate issue. Anyways, one of my specific academic interests is liminality. And when I'm talking about liminality, I'm not necessarily, I'm not talking about like an empty hallway after dark or something. I'm talking about the space that exists in between subject and object, the space of, in a way, becoming and birth. And I was wondering, I suppose, if the incarcerated person, if the incarcerated body becomes a liminal subject, and as a liminal being, if their interlocking oppressions make them uniquely situated in order to identify, I guess, weaknesses in larger structures and systems of oppression and domination. So I was wondering what you all thought about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope. Susan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your brilliant contributions. I'm Susan. I'm a fourth year in Columbia College. And I, like other people here, was really struck by the discussion of imagination. I'm writing a senior thesis under Professor Harcourt's supervision on underground print culture and intellectual production of incarcerated people in the prison uprising years. And something that I was struck by when I'm doing my research is these moments where, attorneys are helping their clients, like George Jackson, Soledad Brother, they're helping get the word out, they're helping facilitate the process of getting these texts published. But there are also moments of conflict, right? And moments where Jackson specifically is thinking about how, his attorney and his editor are sort of censoring what he is trying to say. And so I'm thinking about how that comes up in your legal practice, if it does, and how you sort of negotiate balancing the, strategic dimension of being a lawyer with also keeping the imagination alive and building your capacity for imagination with the people that you work with.
Thank you so much, Susan. Okay, so we're going to, all right, yes, I'm sorry, I had given you the mic, and so go for it. And then we're gonna do a tour, but we're gonna continue the conversation over food and drink. Go ahead, yes, sorry.
Sorry, no, and this will be short. I just figured that the mic passed through my hand so many times, I couldn't finally say something. I mean, I just wanted to say that certainly Kendall was lawyering, I think, in Joe's Pub. I think that our work can be in multiple forums. It is our work, it is our job as a movement lawyer to figure out how we can convert different kinds of forums into space for democratic struggle. I think it's also our job to translate what exists in processes and policies to help the community take advantage of the democratic space that exists for them to make their demands. And we can do that translation work, that literacy work. And so it need not just be the courtroom. For anyone who's a lawyer, lawyering can be done outside of that. And good luck.
Thank you. Okay, so while those were lots of topics and lots of questions, of course, I don't think we'll be able to address every single one of them, each of us, but maybe pearls of wisdom and ways of kind of closing this conversation, starting with you, Amna.
All right, I'm just gonna rapid response to a couple of these questions that stuck out. One, Mina, in response to what you just said, I mean, one of the things I've learned in the last year is that housing courts in this country, which now, are fair to kind of understand partly as just eviction courts, even though, yes, people do very important defense work and they are part of the band, we're a product of tenant struggle in the 20th century. I've read about it now in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and at least one other city. So I don't know if that's the case everywhere, but they were a response to demands in tenant struggles as a way to hold landlords accountable. And so to me, that just speaks in part to the need to engage, like it's not enough to win the forum, and then we have to kind of figure out, and of course it's a larger story, but that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to like, this is so I graduated from Barnard in what year was it? 2000, I think. I remember like there were 5 of us who gathered in the square, I don't know what you call it anymore, every week to protest the Iraq War. There were not events in rooms like this of so many young people kind of holding and agitating these questions and coming together. It's so amazing to be here and have this kind of energy. So I wanted to say that. I guess 2 other things I'll say. One is, I think the person back there who said that they were a public defender. Recently, I met with a couple of my students who just graduated from law school and at legal aid offices in Ohio, and they were describing kind of the sense of, you talked about meeting the 25th client and how to kind of, and they were describing a sense of like feeling overwhelmed and kind of, and it was interesting because partly because I'm close to these 2 people, it brought me back to when I was at legal aid and legal services and how often for a long time after I left, I never checked my voicemail because my clients would often just call me in such deep crisis and didn't know who else to call. And then I would feel bad and I didn't know what to do. Okay, so basically like one reflection now from being out of the practice for so long that goes back to the Gilmore's quote I was talking about in terms of where we fight, that's where the state is that now being so far from it, one of the things I can see, and I hope people working in public defense and legal services is basically like, you are feeling the weight of how the state works and what it wants you to feel. It's the structure of the thing. When you're responsible for 25 clients in one day or whatever it is, that is a structural constraint that of course, it's gonna wear on you. It's gonna, whittle you down and all that kind of stuff. Or if you have a client that's calling you and is like getting evicted and they don't know what to do and they're trying to figure out and they don't have anyone else to call, these are all structural conditions. I'm not saying that to say it doesn't matter, but more to say, to try to understand the thing that we're kind of resisting and maybe find a place there to kind of continue the struggle. In response to a person who said that they were an abortion doctor, one of the things I'm really grappling with right now is just how so much of what's being passed as law, whether it's the Supreme Court or through the courts, whether it's the Supreme Court, ruling against abortion, or it's the failure to regulate guns or the environment, it is so deeply unpopular across the United States. And part of what we're facing is precisely just how deeply undemocratic the state and the laws are. I don't mean to say we all agree on everything, but I think there's a lot of core shit that a lot of the public actually agrees on. And there's this there's a disconnect of those in power and those who have legislative power or judicial power and the kind of the stuff that most people agree on. And at the same time, the way that then continues to kind of feed a sense of hopelessness that then makes people, not want to engage and or then protest and rebel. And that's where our openings are. But I think that's really important to kind of contend with is how deeply undemocratic, because I think if you listen to the news or anything, you get the sense that like there's a small number of people that, for example, want to fund alternatives to police. But no, there's all sorts of polling now that shows that lots of people in the public want things like that because duh. And The last thing to say, someone asked about student and university struggles. Those are, as Derecka was gesturing at, deeply important. One of the things I've seen being at Ohio State for the last decade is that the ones that seem with the most radical potential and that disrupt the local ecosystem the most are the struggles on campus that are connected to what's happening off campus in the communities that our campuses occupy, buy up land in, and so on and so forth. And so in Columbus, for example, when people have made demands to, for example, or at Ohio State to remove the police from university or organize janitorial or food staff on campus, all these kinds of things that have connections to live struggles off campus are the ones that seem the most generative in the way that Derecka was talking about at WITS as well.
Thank you so much, Amna. Derecka, a few thoughts.
Questions.
And we're also going to have the blog open for more answers and,
Yes.
conversation.
Yes, more assignments, yes. Thank you. Oh, wow, so many fantastic questions. A few things came up for me. I don't know, when you said they're eviction courts, what we call them housing courts, I think it's really important to say that they're eviction courts. And I've been especially pushed on this by lawyers in other countries who, like my friend Adam, he doesn't say that he doesn't work with immigration lawyers. He works with anti-border lawyers. There is a difference, right? And so I think, and part of using the language to politicize our orientation to the violence can help inform our theory of change. And then that comes through what I've been saying all night and now the last 3 days is the political home. This, what you were saying too, this also came up for me when you said, we need lawyers. I absolutely agree. I feel like I'm getting a lot of pushback because I said lawyers need to be more than just lawyers. And I stand by that, especially because in law school, you're not going to get radical communist lawyers who are doing lots of different interesting things. You're not going to get the stories of people in Chicago who said, go get the Reds, we're being evicted, we need to stop the eviction. The Reds were communists. You are going to get the litigation-driven public interest routes. So I felt that was important to approach it with that angle. But in addition to people feeling helpless about the kinds of things where we have a lot of core agreement on, there's also been and don't be mad at me, but like a ACLU-ification of how we address a problem. So everything is like, donate to the ACLU. It's not like, what it means to then be in struggle, what everyday people, what it means to be in struggle is to make a donation to a legal organization to fight. It's like, okay, so my option of feeling helplessness, I can go protest with some signs and I can donate to the ACLU or some other major organization. And do we need major legal organizations to fight? Absolutely. But then what happens is that, I did my part, right? I'm not gonna find a political home. I'm not gonna join an organization. I'm not gonna figure out how to continue to have conversations. And so I am nervous, and that's something that has, I would say changed since 1990. The article came out the year I was born. So that's something I know. I didn't choose that year. Yeah, so but in reading it, I think this is why. No, but I think this is why what you say in the piece and we can talk about this later about lawyers being narrativists and invoking particular histories of memory. Because then if you know what lawyers and other people did in struggles, years ago, you will see that, oh, wow, there's different strategies to approach this instead of just relying on professionalization. So I encourage people to just not just think about how do I shift the fight to other people? How do I outsource my movement relationships? How do I outsource my struggle by putting it in someone else's, job, putting it in someone else's career? So that is absolutely, so we need doctors too, right? We need doctors to help people. We also need doctors in political struggle. And we have robust traditions of that, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. Robust traditions of defense lawyers, where were they? In Brazil or Chile, who organized for equal funding for public defenders and prosecutors, right? And the same amount of caseloads. And I can't remember what town, but they won that. And then what happened, it increased the prestige for public defenders. We can talk about whether that's reformers or non-reformers reform, but it increased the prestige and an opportunity for people to go into that kind of work, right? So that is just, we have to get out the country and get in more into our history. The liminal space, honestly, I didn't even understand the first part of the question, but by the time you got to the second part of the question, I've heard different versions of that around people who have directly impacted experiences can then use that as an opportunity to understand or have some wherewithal on how to describe the system in a particular space. And I think that's true, but I think identity is a lens and it is not an analysis. And we need both to be able to untack. There's a lot of directly impacted people who are fighting to improve the strength of the carceral state. And because of the way that directly impacted is being used as a term within the neoliberal society that we have, we're expected to defer to people who then have experience to say, well, we need to build better feminist pink jails. And it's just like, I'm very serious. Now, Sarah can talk about that. She's been organized with a group of people here to stop Columbia support for more jails, right? A new jail that's here. And so how do we understand, again, identity as a lens, but not the only thing that's going to help us? And then, sorry, this question about imagination, I think about imagination a lot. And where I've been landing for the past several years is that imagination is neutral, right? I learned imagination probably from Barney. So it sounded really exciting when I think about imagination because I learned it from a giant purple dinosaur. But you realize that imagination is neutral. And all of this oppression that we have, the systemic oppression, that was someone's imagination, right? Like they weren't natural order. Like these are their imagination. And the people who imagine the violent systems that we have imagination, they have money. Sometimes they have the New York Times on our side. They have weapons. They have all of these forces. And so what we have to do is have not only much more imagination, but people power to combat all of what we're up against because their imagination becomes flesh. And so we have to figure out how to resist their imagination and how it manifests. I love this question about movements and cross-pollinizations. I'm in lots of spaces where that happens. And so where abolition, for example, is a lens for how to do work and not necessarily like we're an abolitionist organization. So Dream Defenders is an abolitionist organization because it's an analysis and a strategy to approach the kind of work that we do. Fight Toxic Prisons. Fight Toxic Prisons is using climate justice and prison abolition as a lens to be able to close prisons and our toxic sites and prevent ones from opening. And so I think it's important for us to be and do political education, be in struggle, so we can learn how these things intersect and then inform our approach. The advertising, I don't know, I'm trying to figure that out too. That was fascinating because we're up against a lot. How students can get involved. Political home, that's gonna always be the answer to find a political home. But there was someone said something that universities rarely can get involved in abolition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You acknowledge that universities, they are often involved on the other side. So like investing in prisons and their endowments and all that stuff too. I implore students, and this is something I, again, didn't come into consciousness around until I was around people who are more curious and courageous than I was. But when people often say the university, they think of students and they think of faculty. They do not think about the people who sweep the floors. They do not think about the people who cook the food. They do not think about the contractual workers. And so I think that the university is much broader than the administration, the faculty and students, and which means that different kinds of people have always had different relationships to the carceral state and resistance against it. And so in our organizing, our conversations, I just think it's just important for us to be mindful of all the people who are gonna break down this room when we leave and put the chairs up because they're part of the university too. And I bet you they're probably in struggle against the university because they're being exploited in other ways. And so it's not that the university has an endowment out there. Most universities I'm familiar with buy and sell people as packages through contractual labor. And then that puts people in closer proximity to the carceral state as well. I know I get the emails every time there's a robbery on campus. I tried to unsubscribe from the emails. You can't unsubscribe from the emails. I tried to block the emails. I got the emails and I can't block the emails. I'm out of emails telling me how violent and dangerous it is around Columbia, but Columbia isn't responsible for pressing, the borders further and further out. That then makes people precarious. And so I think that we should expand our scope of the university. This is not an original idea, and think about the ways that everyone can get involved. There's so many more, but I know we're so short on time.
All right. And we're going to give the final word to Dr. Cornel West.
Well, I'm just so blessed to be here. There is a sweet spirit in this place. You all feel it? Do you feel the spirit? No, but we got some Socratic energy going and prophetic energy going, but most importantly, we try to be unflinchingly honest about how dim and bleak things really are, yet we're still determined to fight. And that's very, very crucial. And to have you all wrestling with my peace in the way in which you have, you don't know how much that honors me in terms of trying to keep alive the traditional struggle that I've been trying to do for the last 55 years or so, and intend to be faithful until the worms get my body. That's just how I'm going out. You know, you keep swinging, you keep swinging. I come from a tradition that says it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. But at the same time, the issues of self-governance, crucial. My dear brother's text on the radical cooperative movement. How do you get citizens, everyday people, poor people, working people, gay brothers, lesbian sisters, non-gender conforming, whole host of folk engaged in cultivating capacity for governance, as they call into question neoliberal authorities, neo-fascist authorities, and so on. It's very, very important. I also come from tradition, I'm gonna end on this. Henry Highland Garnett, it's the first time Black people came together in the National Civic Association in Philadelphia, and he's standing there with one leg. He'd already given a leg to struggle for Black freedom. He's leaning on a crutch, probably a little gangster lane, but we didn't really get a picture of it. And he tells the Black folk, never confuse the situation of Black people was that of the Israelites of the Hebrew scripture. For us, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Seas. Now, I heard Brother Sharpton at the eulogy the other day talking about Martin Luther King Jr. stood on top of the mountaintop. And he said, we're going to get there. And when he looked over, he saw Kamala Harris and Barack Obama. I said, get off the crack. Get off the crack. I love you. That's not what Martin said. He saw new pharaohs, he saw black pharaohs, he saw brown pharaohs, he saw a number of different pharaohs becoming more colorful in an empire with its class hierarchy and its gender hierarchy and its imperial policies and its militarism around the world. That's what our dear brother Martin saw. He had a blue sensibility given his Christian practice. But this is where the arts come in. There was a sister in the back. Everybody feeling so down and out. And they say, could somebody sing a song, please? And they enacted the anthem of Black people, which is lift every voice, not echo. It's not an extension of echo chamber. It's not just utterances that come out of the side. It's voice. You got to find your voice. The way Billie Holiday found it, the way Coltrane found it, the way Aretha found it. You move from an echo and imitation and copy to a voice which is unique and singular and only yours, just like your fingerprint. And those voices, they had confronted all the ugliness of what we're up against. And they had decided integrity in the face of oppression, honesty in the face of deception, decency in the face of insult, courage in the face of brute force. How come? Because our vocations are predicated on our invocations of those who came before, who gave so much as to who we are, and we may be able to pass it on, and yet at the same time we're honest about the pharaohs on so many sides of the bloody Red Sea. So when we talk about lawyering and lawyers in the progressive movement, it's not just domestic, it's global, it's international. Solidarity was happening in Iran with our brothers and sisters. Solidarity to Muslim brothers and sisters in China. We can go on and on. Palestinians in the West Bank. Jews wrestling with anti-Jewish hatred in France and so many other places. Black folk here, landless peasants in Brazil. It's broad, it's universal, it's embracing vis-a-vis humanity, solidarity consistent, not based on skin pigmentation, but based on who is suffering, who are being victimized by asymmetric relations of power, and what are the ways in which we can be in solidarity with the voices that we hear over against whatever structural domination is in place. And so in the end, we end with a joy. The arts authorize an alternative reality by using our imagination and our empathy and then finding joy in struggle with each other. That's very important. You don't find joy in struggle, you're gonna be a sprinter, not a long distance runner. You're gonna run into folk. Yeah, you were into that justice business, but I got out of that because oh, so you weren't a marathoner after all. Huh? It wasn't about vocation commitment. It was just a lifestyle choice. Any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. You got to have a care for the people. You got to have a concern for the people. You got to have a deep love in the deepest sense of the Jewish conception of hesed, steadfast love, loving kindness, constant, steady for people who are suffering, no matter who, no matter what color, no matter what nature. It's what keeps the best of the species alive. And we may still lose the planet and the species. Cockroaches take over. We don't know. History is open-ended. But precisely because it's open-ended, it means we still have a chance. And that's why this center is so important. That's why my brother's leadership is so important. And that's why we find a joy even as we shed some tears and crack some smiles and know that some of us will more than likely, as America moves to neo-fascism, get killed, murdered, incarcerated. Mumia Abu-Jamal, we got his case. We got a gathering in Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, March the 11th. He's got one more chance. That's just one example. So many other political prisoners. And then so many other folk outside. But thank you all so very much for being here. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Fonda, Shen, for all organizing and getting everything done. Thanks to the AV team. Thanks, Reno, and everyone, and to the custodians and John and everyone who set this room up and who's going to help break it down. We're going to break bread. So we have some food and we have some wine, and we're going to be here to continue the conversation. And don't forget to join us on February 21st for the next 1313 with Fred Moten and Kayama Green. I'll be there. We'll be reading Dan Rogers' new book, Concrete Utopianism. It's going to be at the Museum Française, February 21, 6 p.m. with Fred Moten. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much. So many content.